What if everything you learned about Egypt's pharaohs was an elegant lie? Textbooks call them god kings and guardians of Ma'at, but hidden inscriptions and sealed chambers tell a darker truth. Ritual murders, purges, torture, and dynasties held together by fear. This isn't rumor, it's a documented pattern carved in stone. Tonight we uncover 33 depraved Egyptian pharaohs who made Caligula look innocent, their brutality, paranoia, and secret rites buried beneath centuries of sanitization. If dark history calls to you, subscribe. Tell me where you're watching from and what unholy hour it is. Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Sydney? Our descent begins with the first crack in the facade. The court at Abydos reeked of animal fat and burning incense. In the flickering light of oil lamps, nobles prostrated themselves before a throne occupied by a man whose name meant serpent, a fitting title for Egypt's first documented royal executioner. Around 3000 BCE, King Djait ruled with divine authority, his cartouche carved into ivory labels found in royal tombs. But those same archaeological sites tell another story, one written in ash and bone. The official narrative presents Djait as one of Egypt's foundational rulers, a divine link in the early dynastic chain. Egyptologists describe the First Dynasty as a period of consolidation, where pharaonic power was establishing itself as both political and religious authority. Museum displays show his elegant ivory labels, his royal seals, the markers of early civilization taking root along the Nile. But when archaeologists excavated the royal necropolis at el-Ka'ab in the 1980s, they found something the ancient scribes failed to mention: burn layers, thick deposits of ash and charcoal surrounding the elite burial complexes. Not random fires, systematic destruction. The stratigraphy tells a clear story. These fires were set deliberately, consuming the tombs and belongings of nobles who had built their eternal resting places too close to the king. Dr. Günter Dreyer's excavations revealed the pattern. Wealthy officials who sought favor by constructing their mastaba tombs near Djait's burial site instead found their monuments reduced to smoking ruins. The archaeological evidence suggests state-sanctioned destruction, purges of the elite disguised as divine wrath. Pottery sherds from the burn layers show signs of deliberate breaking, personal belongings smashed before burning, as if the destruction carried personal malice. What makes this discovery so chilling is its calculated nature. These weren't enemy raids or accidental fires. The burning happened during Djait's reign, targeting specific individuals whose only crime was seeking royal proximity. Ancient graffiti found on pottery fragments includes curses against those who displease the serpent, suggesting the executions were ritualized, possibly involving accusations of treason or impiety. One ivory label, now in the British Museum, shows Djait performing the running of the Apis bull, a ceremony that supposedly demonstrated royal vigor. But microscopic analysis of organic residues on similar artifacts reveals traces of human bone ash mixed with animal remains. The ritual wasn't just about bulls. From the very beginning, loyalty to the throne could end with your tomb on fire and your name scratched from history. The Serpent King had taught Egypt its first lesson in royal terror, one that would echo through 33 centuries of increasingly refined cruelty. And he was only the beginning. Stone blocks tower at Giza like a mountain built by human suffering. Workers' villages hum with the sound of 10,000 voices. Overseers' shouts echoing off limestone that will outlast empires. In the shadow of humanity's most famous monument, the smell of sweat, dried fish, and fear hangs in the desert air. This is Khufu's kingdom, where divine architecture demands human sacrifice. The official narrative paints Khufu as history's greatest builder, the visionary pharaoh who conceived the last surviving wonder of the ancient world. Modern documentaries soften his image into that of an ambitious engineer, a king who understood mathematics and logistics. Tour guides at Giza speak reverently of his organizational genius and architectural legacy. But the papyri tell a different story. The Westcar papyrus, written centuries after his death, preserves memories too dark for official court records. In one tale, Khufu orders a prisoner decapitated just to watch a magician attempt resurrection, a casual cruelty that reveals how his contemporaries really viewed their god king. Another story describes him prostituting his own daughter to fund pyramid construction, though this may be later propaganda designed to blacken his memory. More reliable are the administrative records discovered at Wadi al-Jarf in 2013. These papyri, written by a team leader named Meirer, document the pyramid's construction with bureaucratic precision. But between the lines about limestone deliveries and copper tools lies a darker reality. Workers are listed by number, not name. Ration distributions are tied to performance, fail to meet quotas, and families starve. Gang leaders report disciplinary actions against workers who collapse from exhaustion or injury. The workers' barracks, excavated southeast of the pyramid, reveal the human cost of immortality. Skeletons show signs of repetitive stress injuries, herniated discs, and fractured bones that healed poorly. Evidence of labor so intensive it broke human bodies. Analysis of food remains indicates strict rationing: bread, onions, garlic, and beer in precisely calculated amounts. Too little to build strength, just enough to prevent revolt. Graffiti carved into the pyramid's hidden chambers includes messages from work gangs with names like Drunkards of Menkar and Friends of Khufu. But other inscriptions tell grimmer stories: curses against overseers, prayers for dead comrades, desperate pleas to gods who seemed as indifferent as their pharaoh. Perhaps most telling is the organization of the pyramid town itself. Unlike later construction sites, Khufu's complex was built like a prison. Single entrances, guard posts, walls that kept workers in rather than enemies out. Archaeological evidence suggests the workforce was a mix of conscripted peasants, prisoners of war, and criminals, men who built eternity knowing they would never live to see it completed. The Great Pyramid stands as humanity's greatest achievement, but its foundation rests on something far darker: the first industrial-scale application of human suffering in service to divine ego. Khufu didn't just build a monument, he built a machine for breaking bodies and souls, all to ensure his name would last forever. If this is what divinity looks like in the Old Kingdom, imagine what happens once the empire learns to enjoy cruelty. The reliefs at Abusir tell two stories. In the upper registers, Sahur receives exotic gifts from Asiatic princes: gold, incense, precious woods, the fruits of peaceful trade. Below, in scenes the tourists rarely photograph, bound captives kneel in rows, while scribes count severed hands like inventory. Welcome to 5th Dynasty diplomacy, where every trade mission returned with human trophies. The textbook version describes Sahure as a sophisticated ruler who expanded Egypt's trading networks into the Levant and Africa. His reign from 2487 to 2475 BCE supposedly marked a golden age of cultural exchange, artistic refinement, and economic prosperity. His pyramid complex at Abusir showcases some of the finest relief carving in Egyptian art, depicting exotic animals, foreign dignitaries, and abundant natural resources flowing into Egypt. But those same exquisite reliefs reveal something museums prefer not to discuss. In scene after scene, Sahur's diplomatic missions return with more than trade goods. Bound prisoners march in endless processions, their arms tied behind their backs, ropes cutting into their necks. Scribes meticulously record the human inventory. Asiatics captured, 1,154. Nubians taken, 2,387. Hands severed, 4,732. The Palermo Stone, a crucial chronicle of early dynastic history, records Sahur's expeditions with chilling matter-of-factness. His Majesty brought back alive 67 Asiatics from one campaign. But the word alive is crucial. It implies many others were not. Complementary inscriptions describe purification rituals involving enemy captives, suggesting mass executions disguised as religious ceremonies. Archaeological evidence from Sahur's pyramid complex includes chambers specifically designed for processing prisoners, stone tables with drainage channels, walls stained with organic residues that forensic analysis confirms as human blood. These weren't sacrifice rooms. They were trophy factories where enemy dead were mutilated for display. Severed hands were dried, counted, and stored in ceramic jars as proof of royal military prowess. The human details make it worse. Relief scenes show captive children separated from their mothers, elderly prisoners stumbling under the weight of wooden yokes, wounded men bleeding from spear thrusts that were designed to disable, not kill immediately. These people weren't soldiers. Analysis of skeletal remains from mass graves near the pyramid suggests many were civilians, families caught in raids disguised as trade expeditions. One particularly disturbing relief shows Sahur personally inspecting piles of severed hands while scribes record the count. But it's not just administrative, the king is smiling. This wasn't just policy, it was entertainment. Contemporary papyri reveal how the system worked. Trade expeditions were military operations in disguise. Egyptian merchants, protected by armed guards, would identify wealthy settlements or poorly defended villages. The guards would then return with larger forces, claiming the locals had threatened or cheated the traders. The resulting massacres were framed as legitimate retaliation for commercial disputes. Foreign princes learned to play along with this brutal charade. Letters found in Syrian archives from this period show rulers sending tribute not as gestures of respect, but as protection money. The goods of Byblos are prepared for His Majesty, reads one increasingly desperate message. May the king's heart be pleased and may his soldiers not come again. Sahur's reign established a template that would last for centuries. Diplomacy as marketing, reality as systematic violence on the borders. Trade routes flowed with goods and gore in equal measure, and Egypt grew rich on both. Diplomacy? That was the brochure version. A child sits beneath towering fan bearers, gold chains heavy around his neck. Too young to understand the magnitude of the throne he's inherited. Decades later, that same throne props up an ancient king who has outlived his kingdom's coherence. Court officials whisper in corridors while the pharaoh of Lower and Upper Egypt loses himself in increasingly bizarre obsessions, leaving the nation to slowly cannibalize itself in his absence. Pepi II officially ruled for 94 years, the longest reign in recorded history. Egyptologists celebrate this as a symbol of stability and divine endurance, noting that he ascended the throne around age 6 and died in his 100th year. His pyramid at Saqqara, though smaller than Giza's giants, demonstrates continued royal building projects throughout his reign. For nearly a century, one name appeared on official documents, suggesting unprecedented continuity, but longevity and governance are different things entirely. By Pepi II's middle years, central authority had effectively collapsed. Provincial governors, called nomarchs, stopped waiting for orders from a distant, aging pharaoh who had ceased to function as a ruler. Tomb inscriptions from local officials during this period show a telling pattern. They stopped mentioning the king entirely, instead recording their own achievements, their own military campaigns, their own building projects. The historical record preserves glimpses of how strange Pepi II's court became. Classical writers, drawing from lost Egyptian sources, describe a pharaoh obsessed with bizarre rituals and petty luxuries. Plutarch records the story of naked dancers covered in honey to distract flies from the king during outdoor ceremonies, a detail too specific to be entirely fictional, suggesting the court had devolved into surreal theater. Administrative papyri from his later reign show the bureaucracy running on autopilot. The same formulaic phrases appear year after year. His Majesty has decreed, by the will of the God King, may he live forever. But these documents often contradict each other or reference events that never happened. The royal administration had become a cargo cult of kingship, maintaining the forms while the substance evaporated. Archaeological evidence paints a picture of creeping chaos. During the final decades of Pepi II's reign, regional monuments grow larger and more elaborate, while royal constructions dwindle. Local rulers begin incorporating royal symbols into their own burial complexes, not as tribute, but as appropriation. They weren't honoring the distant pharaoh, they were replacing him. The human cost was enormous. Without central coordination, irrigation systems failed. Trade networks collapsed as nomarchs fought petty wars over water rights and granary access. Skeleton evidence from cemeteries dating to this period shows increased malnutrition and violent death. As the god king retreated into his palace cocoon, real people died from preventable famines and regional conflicts. Most telling are the tomb autobiographies of officials who lived through Pepi II's decline. Instead of the traditional formulaic praise for royal wisdom and justice, these inscriptions read like desperate resumes, Officials list their own accomplishments, their own resources, their own ability to maintain order in their regions. They weren't serving the pharaoh anymore. They were advertising their readiness to replace him. When Pepi II finally died, the old kingdom effectively died with him. Not because he was a great king, but because his century-long absence from actual governance had taught Egypt's elite that the pharaoh was optional. The unity that had taken centuries to build disintegrated in months, leaving a political vacuum that would take generations to fill. A kingdom ruled by a godchild, slowly suffocated under his own shadow. Cliff tombs carved into the limestone above Thebes stare down at the Nile like empty eye sockets. Beneath them, archaeologists have uncovered mass graves filled with warriors whose skulls bear the crushing marks of maces, whose ribs show the puncture wounds of spears. The desert wind carries the echo of ancient screams across bone-dry valleys, where Egypt's great reunifier built his legacy on systematic slaughter. Official history celebrates Mentuhotep II as the hero king who ended the first intermediate period around 2055 BCE. Reuniting Upper and Lower Egypt under Theban rule. His mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahari, an architectural marvel carved into the cliffs, supposedly demonstrates the return of royal building power and national unity. Museums display his victory reliefs, his restored royal titulary, the symbols of a kingdom reborn. But unity came with a price tag written in blood. Archaeological excavations around his mortuary temple have revealed what those victory reliefs don't show: industrial-scale killing. Not just soldiers fallen in battle, but evidence of systematic executions, mass burials of prisoners, and deliberate elimination of entire rival dynasties. The painted reliefs inside his temple complex, long closed to tourists, depict scenes that would make modern war crimes tribunals weep. Rows of bound captives await execution, while Mentuhotep himself, painted larger than life, personally supervises the slaughter. One particularly disturbing scene shows enemy nobles forced to their knees while their children watch, scribes carefully recording the proceedings as if documenting a grain harvest. Dr. Dieter Arnold's excavations in the 1970s uncovered mass burial sites containing over 600 bodies, all dating to Mentuhotep's reunification campaigns. Forensic analysis reveals a pattern. These weren't warriors who died in combat. The wounds are execution style, crushing blows to the back of the skull, severed necks, bodies deliberately mutilated post-mortem. Many show signs of torture: broken fingers, gouged eyes, ribs systematically shattered, while the victim was still alive. Contemporary texts provide the administrative details. The Hekanasht papyri include references to cleansing operations in recently conquered territories. Officials report eliminating the seeds of rebellion and ensuring no rival claims survive. The language is bureaucratic, but the meaning is clear. Mentuhotep wasn't just defeating enemies. He was erasing bloodlines. Even more chilling are the religious justifications preserved in temple inscriptions. Mentuhotep's priests developed elaborate theological explanations for mass murder. Rival kings weren't just political opponents. They were chaos incarnate, enemies of Ma'at, pollution requiring purification. By framing genocide as religious necessity, the killings became not just acceptable, but holy. The human details survive in unexpected places. Ostraca, limestone flakes used for informal writing, found near the temple include shopping lists that mention linen for wrapping the northern dead and natron for preserving enemy heads. These weren't battle trophies. They were administrative receipts for processing human remains on an industrial scale. One particularly haunting discovery: children's toys found in the same deposits as adult skeletons. Wooden dolls, carved animals, spinning tops. Evidence that entire families were eliminated, not just fighting-age males. The archaeology doesn't lie. Mentuhotep's reunification involved killing entire bloodlines to prevent future rebellion. Within a decade, resistance to Theban rule had effectively ceased. Not because Mentuhotep was a brilliant general or a skilled diplomat, but because everyone who might have opposed him was dead. He achieved unity the same way a plague achieves silence, by eliminating every voice that might dissent. When Egypt wants unity, it buys it with bodies. And the Middle Kingdom that followed would be built on a foundation of bones, held together by the shared memory of what happened to those who refused to kneel before Theban power. If the Middle Kingdom began with blood, what came next would drown in it. The fortress at Semneh rises from the Nile's granite cliffs like a stone fist, its walls scarred by decades of desert wind and human desperation. Below, in the narrow corridor where the river cuts through Nubia, soldiers inspect every boat, every traveler, every face that dares approach Egypt's southern border. Welcome to the world's first militarized checkpoint state, where racial profiling was carved into stone and fear became foreign policy. Around 1870 BCE, Senusret III ruled in Egypt that had learned to weaponize paranoia. Official accounts celebrate him as a military genius and administrative reformer who secured Egypt's borders and strengthened royal authority. His campaigns into Nubia supposedly protected Egyptian trade routes and established lasting peace through strength. Modern textbooks praise his defensive strategy and border security, but those borders tell a different story. The Semneh Stela, now in Berlin's Egyptian Museum, preserves Senusret's own words, and they read like a manifesto of ethnic hatred. No black shall cross this boundary by water or by land, by ship or by any herds of the blacks, the inscription declares. Not enemy soldiers, not hostile armies, blacks, all of them. The fortress system Senusret built wasn't just military, it was a surveillance state. Archaeological surveys have revealed a network of watchtowers, signal fires, and inspection points stretching for hundreds of miles along the Nile. Every structure was positioned for maximum observation and control. Approaching boats could be monitored for days before reaching the actual border, their cargo and passengers cataloged by scribes who maintained detailed records of racial classifications. Papyrus documents from the fortress garrisons discovered in the 1960s reveal the daily operations of this ancient border control. Guards recorded not just names and destinations, but physical descriptions: height, skin color, tribal markings, accent when speaking Egyptian. Nubians were classified into subcategories based on perceived threat levels. Even Egyptian citizens were subject to interrogation if they had spent time in Nubian territories. The human cost becomes clear in the fortress cemeteries. Skeletons of Nubian merchants, their bones showing signs of violent death, buried without grave goods in unmarked pits outside the fortress walls. These weren't warriors. Forensic analysis reveals they were traitors, some with Egyptian coins in their possession, killed simply for being in the wrong place with the wrong skin color. But the system's true horror lay in its efficiency. The fortress commander at Uranarti, according to his tomb inscription, was rewarded for preventing contamination of Egyptian soil and maintaining purity of the sacred borders. The language is religious, but the implementation was coldly bureaucratic. Rejection, detention, execution, all processed through proper channels with appropriate paperwork. One papyrus fragment. It describes a group of Nubian children separated from their families during a border inspection who were retained for evaluation of their utility to the crown. The clinical language can't hide what happened. Child trafficking disguised as immigration policy, with racial categories determining who lived, who died, and who disappeared into Egyptian forced labor systems. Contemporary Nubian inscriptions, found at sites south of the fortresses, tell the other side of the story. They describe families torn apart, trade routes abandoned, entire communities relocating deeper into Africa to escape Egyptian purification patrols. The economic disruption was catastrophic and intentional. Senusret III didn't just build walls. He built a system that turned racial fear into state policy, transforming Egypt's southern border from a line on the map into an ideological barrier enforced by steel and stone. The fortress network would outlast his dynasty, but the precedent would last far longer. This wasn't security. It was fear, codified, sanctified, and built to last forever. Chisels ring against limestone in the pre-dawn darkness. Stonemasons work by torchlight, carefully carving new cartouches over old ones, erasing Amenemhat Ifu's name from temple walls while scribes burn papyri that mention his reign. By sunrise, history itself will be different. Welcome to the workshop of Egypt's first female pharaoh, where legitimacy was manufactured one lie at a time. Sobekneferu ruled for less than 4 years, around 1806 BCE, officially recognized as the first woman to hold full pharaonic titles in Egyptian history. Egyptologists celebrate her as a pioneering female ruler who bridged the 12th and 13th dynasties during a difficult transition period. Her monuments at Mazguna, though unfinished, demonstrate that she maintained royal building projects and commanded sufficient resources to assert her authority. But asserting authority and having legitimacy are very different things. Archaeological evidence suggests Sobekneferu came to power through systematic erasure of her predecessor's memory, not just political opposition, but historical assassination on an industrial scale. The evidence lies in the stones themselves. Throughout Egypt, monuments originally built for Amenemhat IV show signs of deliberate recarving. At Hawara, entire wall sections were chiseled out and replaced. The work wasn't casual vandalism. It required teams of skilled craftsmen, massive resources, and royal authorization. Someone was paying enormous sums to make Amenemhat IV disappear from history. Dr. Aidan Dodson's analysis of royal monuments from this period reveals a pattern of systematic appropriation. Statues originally carved for the male pharaoh were recut with feminine features and new inscriptions. Temple reliefs showing Amenemhat IV performing royal duties were modified to show Sobekneferu instead. Even administrative seals and pottery stamps were systematically replaced throughout the bureaucracy. The most telling evidence comes from Mazguna, where Sobekneferu attempted to build her pyramid complex. The site shows signs of frantic, expensive construction that was never completed. Massive foundation stones lie scattered. Half-carved statues abandoned mid-project. Workers' camps hastily evacuated. The archaeology suggests a ruler who knew her time was limited and was desperately trying to create permanent legitimacy before someone else could erase her. Contemporary papyri from provincial administrators reveal the chaos this created. Local officials received contradictory orders, first to honor Amenemhat IV's memory, then to destroy his monuments, then to pretend he had never existed. Tax records show enormous expenditures for memorial corrections and historical purification projects. The bureaucracy was literally paying to rewrite the past. Foreign correspondence from this period shows how other kingdoms viewed this historical revisionism. A letter from a Levantine prince, preserved in cuneiform, asks Egyptian officials which pharaoh he should address in trade negotiations, since the name on the treaties changes with each full moon. Egypt's credibility was collapsing, along with its historical consistency. The human cost was enormous. Craftsmen who had worked on Amenemhat IV's monuments were faced with impossible choices: destroy their own work or face accusations of disloyalty. Some tomb inscriptions from this period show artists literally carving apologies into their own creations, begging forgiveness for having honored the false king. But perhaps most chilling is what happened to the royal mummies. Later, papyri suggests that Amenemhat IV's burial was relocated during Sobekneferu's reign, a euphemism that probably means his body was destroyed to prevent any future restoration of his cult or memory. In ancient Egypt, where eternal life depended on preserved bodies and spoken names, this was murder that extended beyond death. Sobekneferu's reign established a precedent that would haunt Egyptian politics for centuries. When legitimacy was weak, history became clay. Memory was just another resource to be seized, shaped, and weaponized by whoever controlled the chisels. She ruled only 4 years, but her erasures outlived her monuments, teaching future pharaohs that the past belonged to whoever was willing to lie loudest and longest. Smoke rises from the ruins of Avaris, the former Hyksos capital, while Egyptian ships crowd the Nile Delta with human cargo. Bound prisoners stumble down gangplanks, their children crying in languages their new masters don't understand. In the distance, Ahmose watches from his chariot, counting the living inventory that will build his glorious new kingdom. Liberation has never looked so much like slavery. Around 1550 BCE, Ahmose expelled the Hyksos rulers from Egypt and founded the 18th dynasty. Official history celebrates him as the Great Liberator, the native Egyptian king who threw off foreign occupation and restored pharaonic rule after more than a century of Asiatic domination. His victory established Egypt as the dominant power in the ancient Near East and began the New Kingdom period of unprecedented wealth and expansion. But liberation for Egypt meant captivity for thousands of others. The tomb biography of Ahmose, son of Ebena, a naval officer who served under the pharaoh, preserves details that royal scribes preferred to forget. Written on the walls of his tomb at El Kab, this autobiography reads like a war criminal's confession disguised as military service record. I captured 1 man and 3 women, total 4 persons, and His Majesty gave me their goods, the inscription boasts. This wasn't unusual battlefield conduct. It was systematic policy. Ahmose, son of Abana, goes on to describe multiple campaigns where capturing civilians was the primary objective, not a side effect. The text catalogs human beings like livestock. I brought away captives from this place, 1 man, 2 women, and 1 child. Archaeological evidence from sites across the former Hyksos territories confirms this pattern. Excavations at Sharuhen, Tel El Ajul, and other Levantine settlements show destruction layers dating to Ahmose's campaigns, followed by evidence of systematic depopulation. Not just military defeat, demographic erasure. The papyrus Rind, a mathematical text from this period, includes word problems that reveal how the New Kingdom's economy functioned. If 1 Egyptian overseer manages 50 Asiatic workers, and each worker produces 30 units of grain per month, how many overseers are needed for 2,000 captives? Ancient homework assignments that document slavery as economic planning. Royal inscriptions from Ahmose's temples describe the logistical challenge of processing thousands of prisoners. Scribes recorded detailed categorizations: men suitable for quarry work, women for textile production, children for household service or temple duties. The language is administrative, but the reality was human trafficking on an unprecedented scale. Foreign correspondence preserved in Syrian archives provides the other perspective. Letters from Levantine rulers to their Egyptian counterparts during Ahmose's reign read like desperate protection rackets. The people of Byblos send tribute to the great king, may he live forever, and hope his soldiers. Award will not come again to take our children. These weren't diplomatic gifts, they were ransom payments. The most disturbing evidence comes from the workers' villages built to house Ahmose's captive labor force. Excavations reveal compounds designed like prisons, single entrances, guard posts, communal sleeping areas that prioritize surveillance over comfort. Skeletal remains from these sites show high rates of malnutrition, untreated injuries, and early death. But the cruelest detail is preserved in the administrative papyri. Captured families were systematically separated to prevent rebellion. Children were assigned to different work gangs from their parents, husbands separated from wives, siblings scattered across different construction projects. The bureaucracy had learned that broken families were more manageable than intact ones. Ahmose's liberation of Egypt was purchased with the enslavement of entire populations. His new kingdom wasn't built on Egyptian labor. It was built on the backs of Asiatic captives, whose only crime was living in the path of pharaonic ambition. The monuments that tourists admire today rest on foundations mixed with foreign tears. Freedom for 1 population meant chains for thousands of others, and the empire that followed would perfect this equation. Egyptian glory, or foreign suffering, calculated with mathematical precision and administered with bureaucratic efficiency. Incense burns at Deir el-Bahari, where limestone reliefs tell an impossible story. Here, carved in eternal stone, the god Amun approaches Queen Ahmose's bedchamber, divine seed ready to create a daughter destined to rule. The priests nod approvingly as they read the hieroglyphs aloud, their voices lending authority to what everyone knows is complete fabrication. Welcome to the workshop of Egypt's most successful religious propagandist, where gods were scriptwriters and myths were made to order. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt for approximately 22 years during the 15th century BCE, initially as regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III, then as pharaoh in her own right. Modern historians often celebrate her as a peaceful builder queen, a proto-feminist icon who broke gender barriers and presided over an era of artistic flowering and economic prosperity. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari remains one of ancient Egypt's architectural masterpieces. But Hatshepsut's real innovation wasn't architecture. It was theological engineering on an industrial scale. When traditional pharaonic legitimacy failed her, being female in a male-dominated system, she didn't just break the rules, she rewrote the religion itself. The divine birth narrative carved into her temple walls represents one of history's most audacious propaganda campaigns. According to these reliefs, Amun personally selected Queen Amosi, approached her in divine form, and conceived Hatshepsut for the express purpose of ruling Egypt. Not adoption by the gods, literal divine paternity, making her more legitimate than any male pharaoh who merely claimed divine favor. But the reliefs reveal their own fabrication. Subtle details suggest multiple carving phases, with earlier inscriptions modified to strengthen the divine narrative. Microscopic analysis of the limestone shows areas where text was chiseled out and recarved, often multiple times. The eternal word of the gods was being edited in real time. Contemporary administrative papyri reveal how this theological revolution was implemented. Hatshepsut systematically replaced high priests throughout Egypt, with officials loyal to her new narrative. Traditional religious ceremonies were modified to emphasize divine birth stories. Temple revenues were redirected to fund ever larger monuments proclaiming her divine origins. The human cost was enormous. Priests who questioned the new theology faced reassignment to distant temples or outright disappearance from the records. The Karnak priest list, usually a reliable source for religious officials, shows suspicious gaps during Hatshepsut's reign, names simply vanishing from ongoing documentation. Foreign ambassadors' reports, preserved in Hittite archives, describe the confusion this created in international diplomacy. One cuneiform tablet records a Mesopotamian envoy asking Egyptian officials whether they were negotiating with a king, a queen, or a god, since the religious status kept changing, depending on which priest they consulted. Perhaps most revealing are the financial records from her building projects. The costs for Deir el-Bahari far exceeded previous royal monuments, not because of architectural complexity, but because of the elaborate theological infrastructure required to support her divine claims. Armies of scribes, priests, and artists worked full-time, creating and maintaining the mythology of her godhood. The temple's famous Punt expedition reliefs demonstrate how Hatshepsut weaponized even economic achievements. What was probably a routine trading mission to the Horn of Africa was reframed as a divine mandate, Amun personally commanding his daughter to restore trade relationships abandoned by previous kings. Commercial success became religious validation, but the most chilling evidence lies in the systematic modification of existing royal monuments. Throughout Egypt, inscriptions mentioning previous pharaohs' divine relationships were altered to emphasize Hatshepsut's superior theological status. She wasn't just claiming equal legitimacy, she was retroactively making herself more divine than her predecessors. Ancient propaganda may have been more sophisticated than most modern PR campaigns, but it came with a price: the complete subordination of religious truth to political necessity. Hatshepsut didn't just rule Egypt, she conquered its gods, forcing them to validate her authority, whether they wanted to or not. She didn't just rule Egypt, she rewrote the rules of ruling, proving that even gods could be made to kneel before royal ambition. Karnak's walls echo with the sound of chisels biting stone. Workers toil in the sacred precinct, carefully erasing cartouches, smoothing away relief figures, turning 22 years of Hatshepsut's reign into blank limestone waiting for new stories. But this isn't renovation. It's assassination by architecture, the systematic murder of memory itself. Thutmose III has learned that controlling the past is more powerful than conquering the present. Thutmose III ruled Egypt from approximately 1479 to 1425 BCI and earned the title Napoleon of Egypt from admiring Egyptologists who celebrated his military genius. His annals record victorious campaigns across the Levant, his expansion of Egyptian influence to unprecedented boundaries, his transformation of Egypt into the ancient world's dominant superpower. Museums display his triumph reliefs, his detailed battle records, his monuments to imperial glory. But those same monuments tell a darker story about the systematic destruction of his stepmother's legacy. The erasure of Hatshepsut wasn't casual vandalism or spontaneous revenge. It was industrial-scale historical revision that required enormous resources, meticulous planning, and ruthless efficiency. Archaeological analysis of Karnak's defaced monuments reveals the sophisticated methodology behind this memorial genocide. Teams of skilled craftsmen use specialized tools to remove Hatshepsut's images while preserving surrounding decorations. The work required intimate knowledge of carving techniques, access to royal workshops, and coordination across multiple temple complexes simultaneously. This wasn't anger, it was policy. Dr. Charles Van Sicklen's detailed study of the erasures shows they followed a deliberate timeline. First, Hatshepsut's royal cartouches were replaced with neutral symbols. Then her images were recarved as male pharaohs. Finally, entire scenes depicting her reign were chiseled out and replaced with Thutmose's own achievements. The past was being systematically overwritten, layer by layer. But the erasure campaign extended far beyond monuments. Administrative papyri from Thutmose's reign include orders for historical purification of temple records, royal archives, and even private tomb inscriptions that mentioned Hatshepsut. Scribes were instructed to search through decades of documents, identifying and destroying any reference to the female pharaoh's legitimate rule. Contemporary foreign correspondence reveals the international implications of this memory war. Syrian vassal kings, confused by Egypt's changing historical narrative, sent letters asking whether tributes paid during Hatshepsut's reign were still valid, since Egyptian officials now claimed she had never been pharaoh. Diplomatic relationships were collapsing because Egypt couldn't maintain a consistent version of its own past. The human cost becomes visible in private tomb inscriptions from officials who had served both rulers. These biographies show desperate attempts to navigate the new historical reality. Scribes describing their service to the king without specifying which one, or claiming they had always served Thutmose even during Hatshepsut's confirmed regency years. Fear of association with the erased queen had created a climate of retroactive terror. But perhaps most chilling are Thutmose's military annals, which document his foreign campaigns with disturbing precision. The Battle of Megiddo, inscriptions don't just record victory, they catalog human suffering with bureaucratic efficiency. Hands cut off, 340, captives taken, 2,041, horses seized, 9 and 24, citizens enslaved, 15,070. War had become an accounting exercise in human misery. The most infamous passage describes prisoners of war reduced to literal inventory. His Majesty counted the booty of this town, 340 living prisoners, 83 hands, 2,041 horses, 191 foals, 6 stallions. Notice how severed hands are listed alongside livestock. Human body parts had become just another category of war trophy. Archaeological evidence from Levantine sites confirms these numbers aren't exaggerated. Destruction layers at Megiddo, Hazor, and other cities show signs of systematic population removal, with domestic areas stripped of portable goods and bodies buried in mass graves outside the city walls. Thutmose III conquered lands, but his real innovation was conquering the past itself. He proved that controlling memory was more powerful than controlling territory, that historical narrative could be weaponized more effectively than armies. The pharaoh who earned fame as a military genius was actually history's first master of information warfare. He conquered lands, but his real conquest was the past. And Egypt took careful notes on how total victory required total control of memory itself. Wine jars from Cyprus and Crete pile up in Malkata Palace storerooms like ceramic mountains. Exotic animals pace in gilded cages while servants arrange delicacies from across the known world. In the distance, specially constructed hunting parks echo with the roars of lions bred for slaughter. Welcome to Amenhotep III's Egypt, where peace and prosperity created something far more dangerous than war: absolute power with absolutely nothing to restrain it. Amenhotep III ruled Egypt at the height of its imperial power, from approximately 1391 to 1353 BCE. Historians celebrate this as Egypt's golden age, a time of unprecedented wealth, diplomatic influence, and artistic achievement. His reign supposedly represents the pinnacle of pharaonic civilization: peaceful, prosperous, and culturally sophisticated. No major military campaigns, no civil wars, no religious upheavals. Just 38 years of uninterrupted imperial luxury. But the diplomatic correspondence known as the Amarna letters reveals what peaceful prosperity actually looked like from the receiving end. These cuneiform tablets preserve desperate pleas from Egypt's vassals and allies, letters that read like ransom notes disguised as diplomatic correspondence. My lord, king of Egypt, my god, my sun god, the breath of my life, writes Ribadi of Byblos, I fall at the feet of my lord 7 times and 7 times. Why has my lord not written to his servant? I am like a bird in a cage. Send archers that I may remain a servant of the king forever. The language is flowery, but the desperation is obvious. Egypt's peaceful foreign policy meant bleeding its allies dry through impossible tribute demands. The Mitannian king Tushratta's letters are even more revealing. May my brother send me much gold, more gold than my father received, for in my brother's land, gold is as plentiful as dirt. But this wasn't a friendly request between equals. The tablets show that Egypt's gold came with strings attached. Vassal kingdoms were required to send daughters as wives, sons as hostages, and endless streams of tribute to satisfy Amenhotep's appetite for luxury. Archaeological evidence from Malkata, Amenhotep's palace complex near Thebes, confirms what the letters suggest. The site covers over 30 hectares, making it one of the largest royal residences ever built in ancient Egypt. But the opulence borders on the pathological. Dozens of wine cellars, specialized storage areas for exotic spices, holding pens for hundreds of foreign animals, and workshops dedicated solely to manufacturing luxury goods that serve no practical purpose. The famous lion hunt scarabs that Amenhotep issued like press releases provide the most disturbing details. These commemorative beetles record the pharaoh's personal killing of 102 lions during his first 10 years of rule. But archaeological analysis of the royal hunting parks reveals these weren't wild animals. They were captive lions, bred specifically for slaughter, kept in conditions that ensured they would be weak and manageable when released for hunting. Contemporary medical papyri from Amenhotep's court describe treatments for conditions that read like the symptoms of extreme luxury: gout from excessive eating, liver problems from constant wine consumption, dental issues from imported sweets. The pharaoh was literally being poisoned by his own excess, but the court physicians dared not suggest moderation to a living god. The human cost of this golden age becomes visible in workers' villages around Thebes. While the palace gorged itself on imported delicacies, tomb paintings from this period show common Egyptians eating the same simple diet their ancestors had survived on for centuries. The prosperity never trickled down. It pooled exclusively around the throne. Foreign princesses sent as diplomatic wives provide the most heartbreaking evidence. Letters from Babylonian and Mitannian courts describe teenage girls, some as young as 12, shipped to Egypt like luxury commodities. One letter from a Babylonian king asks pathetically if his daughter is even still alive, since no word has come from Egypt since her departure years earlier. But perhaps most revealing are the administrative records that document Amenhotep's building projects. The pharaoh constructed monuments not because Egypt needed them, but because he was bored. Temples to deities he invented, palaces for events that never happened, statues celebrating victories that never occurred. Imperial wealth had become a drug, and Amenhotep was overdosing on his own power. When your hobbies require entire hunting palaces and your wine cellar needs its own administrative staff, you're not exactly the humble servant of Ma'at the propaganda claimed. Amenhotep III had learned that absolute power, unchecked by war or crisis, inevitably corrupts into something monstrous. His pleasures were so numerous they required new palaces, and his son would need an entirely new heaven to contain his own obsessions. The white-hot glare of the A10 burns down on abandoned houses at Amarna, their doorways gaping like screams frozen in limestone. Skeletal dogs wander empty streets where weeds push through palace courtyards that once hosted the pharaoh's divine revelations. In the workers' cemetery, archaeologists uncover bodies twisted by malnutrition, their bones telling the story of a kingdom that forgot to feed itself while chasing a mad king's vision of heaven. Akhenaten ruled Egypt from approximately 1353 to 1336 BCE, and modern historians often celebrate him as history's first monotheist, a revolutionary philosopher king who challenged religious orthodoxy and artistic convention. His new capital at Amarna showcased innovative art styles. His hymns to the A10 influenced later religious poetry, and his apparent devotion to family life seemed to humanize pharaonic power. He's been called everything from a mystic visionary to an ancient proto-reformer, but revolution has a price, and Akhenaten subjects paid it with their lives. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence from his reign, read like dispatches from a collapsing empire. Vassal rulers across the Levant sent increasingly desperate pleas for military assistance that never came, for grain shipments that were never sent, for basic acknowledgement from a pharaoh too obsessed with his solar deity to notice his kingdom burning. To the king, my lord, say, "Message of Ribhada, your servant," writes the mayor of Byblos. 7 times and 7 times I fall at the feet of my lord. Previously I wrote to my lord, "The city is dying of hunger. Now, behold, there is no grain for our food. If no troops come in this year, then all the lands will be joined to the Habaru." The Habaru were nomadic raiders who filled the vacuum left by Egypt's neglect, and Akhenaten never replied. Archaeological evidence from Amarna itself reveals the domestic cost of the king's religious obsession. Barry Kemp's decades-long excavation has uncovered a city built in frantic haste and abandoned in chaos. The royal necropolis shows signs of hasty burials, unfinished tomb decorations, and sarcophagi that were never used. Even the royal family was dying faster than the workshops could process their deaths. But the most damning evidence comes from the workers' village south of the main city. Skeletal analysis by Jerome Rose and others reveals chronic malnutrition affecting over 70% of the population. These weren't foreign slaves or prisoners. They were Egyptian craftsmen, the elite artisans who carved Akhenaten's revolutionary art and built his temples to the Aten. Even the king's chosen people were starving. Administrative papyri from the site show why. Temple resources that traditionally supported public works, food distribution, and local governance were being funneled exclusively into A10 worship. The pharaoh had closed temples across Egypt, confiscating their enormous wealth to fund his new religious capital. The economic disruption was catastrophic and intentional. Contemporary medical papyri describe new diseases appearing during Akhenaten's reign, conditions that modern analysis suggests were nutritional deficiencies. Scurvy, rickets, and anemia spread through Egyptian cities as traditional food distribution networks collapsed. The pharaoh was so busy feeding his god that he forgot to feed his people. Foreign intelligence reports preserved in Hittite archives describe Egypt during this period as the sick land. Diplomatic marriages were canceled, trade agreements abandoned, military alliances dissolved. Egypt's international reputation collapsed, along with its domestic infrastructure, and neighboring powers began planning invasions of territories Egypt could no longer defend. The religious texts Akhenaten composed, carved into tomb walls at Amarna, reveal his growing detachment from reality. Later, hymns describe the A10 as sole provider of life, while Egyptian corpses piled up in mass graves outside the city walls. The pharaoh had achieved perfect religious focus by completely losing sight of everything else. But perhaps most chilling is what happened to dissent. Officials who questioned the new religion weren't just dismissed, they vanished entirely from the records. The Amarna tomb of Akhenaten's eventual successor, includes a relief showing bound prisoners being presented to the king. These aren't foreign captives. Their dress and hairstyles are Egyptian. Akhenaten was processing domestic opposition like enemy prisoners of war. When he finally died, probably from the same malnutrition affecting his subjects, Egypt was a hollow shell held together by religious terror and administrative chaos. His successors would spend decades undoing the damage, restoring the old gods, and trying to forget that a pharaoh had nearly destroyed civilization itself in pursuit of perfect divine communion. In chasing heaven, he let earth crumble, and he didn't fall alone. His kingdom fell with him, one starved body at a time. Relief carvings at Amarna show an elegant queen raising a ceremonial mace above bound captives, the A10's rays blessing her violence with divine approval. Tourists admire Nefertiti's famous beauty, her graceful neck, her mysterious smile. They rarely photograph the scenes where she personally smites Egypt's enemies, her delicate hands wielding weapons designed to crush skulls. Beauty and brutality were never mutually exclusive in ancient Egypt, and Nefertiti proved that revolution could have two faces. Nefertiti is remembered primarily as Akhenaten's beautiful queen, the enigmatic woman whose limestone bust in Berlin's Neues Museum has become an icon of ancient elegance. Popular culture celebrates her as a devoted wife and mother, a supportive partner in her husband's religious revolution, a tragic figure who disappeared mysteriously from the historical record around year 14 of Akhenaten's reign. But the reliefs at Amarna tell a different story. In scene after scene, Nefertiti appears not as a passive royal consort, but as an active participant in the violent suppression of religious opposition. She's depicted performing the traditional pharaonic smiting pose, raising a mace to strike down enemies, something unprecedented for Egyptian queens. This wasn't ceremonial imagery, it was a declaration of co-rulership in the Atenist purge. The boundary stelae of Amarna, carved to mark the sacred limits of Akhenaten's new capital, include Nefertiti's name alongside the king's, in contexts that suggest shared authority over religious policy. More significantly, they reference enemies of the Aten being driven out and purified from the land, language that subsequent archaeological evidence suggests meant systematic persecution of traditional priesthoods. Administrative ostraca, inscribed pottery fragments, from Amarna include references to Queen's Justice and Judgment of the Great Royal Wife, in contexts involving property confiscation from temple personnel. These weren't routine legal proceedings, they were seizures of assets from religious officials who refused to abandon traditional worship. Nefertiti wasn't just witnessing her husband's revolution, she was administering it. The most disturbing evidence comes from the Amarna tomb of Huya, steward to Queen Tai, Akhenaten's mother. Relief scenes show Nefertiti personally receiving tribute from Nubian captives, but the iconography is unusual. The prisoners are bound in ways that suggest they're not foreign enemies, but Egyptian rebels. Their clothing and jewelry identify them as temple personnel, priests, priestesses, and administrators from traditional religious institutions. Contemporary papyri fragments describe cleansing expeditions dispatched from Amarna to temples across Egypt. These missions, operating under joint authority from both Akhenaten and Nefertiti, systematically dismantled religious infrastructure and relocated personnel to re-education facilities near the new capital. The language is bureaucratic, but the reality was cultural genocide administered through proper channels. Foreign diplomatic correspondence from this period references both rulers as responsible for Egypt's increasingly erratic behavior. A letter from the Babylonian king Burnaburiash II specifically mentions the king and his great wife as joint decision-makers in canceled trade agreements and broken diplomatic protocols. Egypt's allies were dealing with a dual monarchy that seemed to have lost contact with reality. Archaeological evidence from sites across Egypt shows systematic destruction of religious monuments during the period when Nefertiti held enhanced authority. At Karnak, Hermopolis, and Memphis, traditional statuary was not just toppled, but deliberately mutilated, faces smashed, hands severed, religious texts chiseled out and replaced with Atenist formulae. This required enormous coordination and resources that could only have come from the highest levels of government. But perhaps most revealing are the personal effects found in Nefertiti's private apartments at Amarna. Among the jewelry and cosmetics, archaeologists discovered small clay figurines of bound prisoners, personal mementos that suggest the queen took satisfaction in the suffering of religious dissidents. These weren't official royal regalia, they were private trophies. The mystery of Nefertiti's disappearance from the historical record around year 14 may not be so mysterious after all. Some scholars now suggest she didn't vanish. She was promoted to co-pharaoh, possibly ruling under the name Nefer-Nefer-Waten during the final years of the Amarna period. If true, it means the persecution of traditional religion intensified under her direct rule. Later Egyptian texts refer to the Amarna period as the time of the enemy, suggesting that subsequent pharaohs viewed both Akhenaten and his queen as equally responsible for the religious and political chaos. The official damnatio memoriae that erased their names from monuments made no distinction between husband and wife. Both were considered equally guilty. Every revolution has two architects, the visionary and the enforcer. Akhenaten may have conceived the 18th revolution, but Nefertiti perfected its implementation, proving that beauty could be as ruthless as any pharaoh when divine authority was at stake. The boy king's tomb in the Valley of the Kings tells two stories. Above ground, tourists marvel at golden treasures and pristine artifacts, evidence of a peaceful transition from the chaos of the Amarna period. Below ground, forensic analysis reveals something more sinister: a hastily arranged burial, incomplete mummification, and a skull fracture that suggests the most famous pharaoh in history may have been murdered at 19. Welcome to the deadliest court in Egyptian history, where every smile hid a blade and every bow concealed an assassination plot. Tutankhamun ruled from approximately 1332–1323 BCE, ascending the throne as a child during Egypt's most turbulent period. Popular culture remembers him primarily for his intact tomb and golden burial mask, treating him as a minor footnote between the dramatic reigns of Akhenaten and Ramesses II. The official narrative presents his reign as a period of restoration, the young king who returned Egypt to traditional religion and began healing the wounds of the Amarna heresy. But the boy king himself was just a puppet in a far more sinister drama. Real power lay with his advisors. The aging courtier who had survived Akhenaten's purges, and Horemheb, the general who commanded Egypt's military. These men didn't guide the young pharaoh. They used him as a royal rubber stamp while conducting a brutal settling of accounts with anyone connected to the previous regime. The restoration stela, erected in Tutankhamun's name at Karnak, describes the return to traditional religion in language that barely conceals the violence involved. The temples of the gods and goddesses were in ruins, their shrines were desolate. If anyone prayed to a god to seek counsel from him, he would never respond. But the stela goes on to promise that His Majesty drove out wrongdoing throughout the two lands and punished crime with divine authority. Contemporary administrative papyri reveal what driving out wrongdoing actually meant. The judicial papyrus of Turin, though from a later period, references trials during the time of the Child King, where officials connected to Akhenaten's regime were systematically prosecuted for treason, impiety, and corruption. Many were executed, others simply disappeared from the records mid-sentence, their names chiseled out of ongoing documents as if they had never existed. But the most explosive evidence comes from Hittite diplomatic archives. The Dakamunzu affair, one of ancient history's most mysterious episodes, began when an Egyptian queen wrote to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma, requesting one of his sons as a husband, claiming, "My husband is dead and I have no son." The Hittite king, suspicious of this unprecedented request, sent an envoy to investigate before agreeing to send Prince Zananza to Egypt. Zananza never arrived. Hittite records state baldly that he was killed while traveling to Egypt, sparking a war between the two empires. But who was this mysterious queen? And why would marrying a Hittite prince require assassination? Most scholars now believe the queen was Ankhesenamun, Tutankhamun's wife, desperately trying to avoid marriage to Ai or Horemheb after her young husband's suspicious death. The forensic evidence supports a conspiracy theory. CT scans of Tutankhamun's mummy, conducted in 2005, revealed multiple suspicious injuries: a severe blow to the head, broken ribs, and a missing sternum. While some damage could be post-mortem, the head trauma shows signs of healing, suggesting the king survived the initial injury before dying from complications, or a second, fatal attack. Archaeological analysis of his tomb reveals the haste with which his burial was arranged. Paint was still wet on some wall decorations when the tomb was sealed. Grave goods were hastily repurposed from other burials, some still bearing the names of previous owners. The famous golden mask may not have been made for Tutankhamun at all. Microscopic analysis suggests the face was altered to match his features, but perhaps most telling is what happened immediately after his burial. Ai, who had served as regent, married Tutankhamun's widow and claimed the throne. Within 4 years, Horemheb had eliminated Ai and established military rule. Both men systematically erased Tutankhamun's brief reign from official records, suggesting they viewed even the dead boy king as a threat to their legitimacy. The international ramifications were catastrophic. Egypt's war with the Hittites, sparked by the Zananza murder, drained resources and military strength for decades. The kingdom that had once dominated the ancient Near East was reduced to a regional power, struggling to maintain its borders against enemies emboldened by internal chaos. The quietest thing about Tutankhamun was his actual voice. Everything around him was a knife fight between courtiers, using a child king's divine authority to settle personal scores and eliminate rivals. His golden mask may be beautiful, but it conceals the skull fracture that ended a life caught between ambitious men who had learned to kill with royal seals. The boy king's death was the quietest event in a loud conspiracy that would echo through Egypt's politics for generations. The temple walls at Abydos gleam like polished ivory under electric lights, their relief carvings so exquisite they seem touched by divine hands rather than human chisels. Tourists marvel at the artistic perfection, the graceful hieroglyphs, the elegant figures of gods blessing their pharaoh. But deeper in the temple complex, past the areas where cameras flash, other reliefs tell different stories. Towns burning, captives screaming, children separated from mothers while scribes count the human inventory. Sati. I understood that the most effective propaganda paired sublime beauty with documented horror. Sati I ruled from approximately 1294 to 1279 BCE, and art historians celebrate his reign as one of the greatest periods in Egyptian artistic achievement. His tomb in the Valley of the Kings contains the finest painting in pharaonic history, while his temple at Abydos showcases relief carving of unprecedented technical perfection. Museums worldwide display his monuments as examples of ancient Egyptian civilization at its cultural peak. But those same artistic masterpieces document systematic violence on an industrial scale. The war reliefs at Karnak Temple, carved with the same exquisite skill as religious scenes, preserve detailed records of Seti's campaigns in Canaan and Libya. These aren't stylized depictions of royal triumph. They are documentary evidence of war crimes carved in eternal stone. The Karnak reliefs show Seti's forces attacking fortified cities with methodical precision. In scene after scene, Egyptian soldiers breach walls, kill defenders, and process civilians like livestock. The artistic detail is so fine that archaeologists can identify specific siege tactics, weapon types, and even individual prisoner characteristics. One particularly disturbing sequence shows Egyptian forces systematically dismantling an enemy city, while scribes record precise tallies of captured goods and people. Contemporary papyri from Seti's reign reveal the administrative infrastructure behind these artistic celebrations of violence. The Anastasi papyri include military dispatches describing cleansing operations in rebellious territories, with detailed requisitions for supplies needed to process prisoners, ropes for binding, tools for marking, rations for feeding captives during transport back to Egypt. Archaeological evidence from Levantine sites confirms the relief scenes aren't exaggerated. Excavations at Lachish, Tel es Safi, and other cities show destruction layers precisely dated to Seti's campaigns, with evidence of systematic population removal and property seizure. The Egyptian war machine was operating like a harvesting operation, efficiently extracting human and material resources from conquered territories. But the most chilling aspect of Seti's reign was how seamlessly violence was integrated into religious and cultural expression. The Abydos temple, dedicated to Osiris and regarded as one of Egypt's holiest sites, contains a king list that carefully omits the names of rulers deemed illegitimate or heretical, a form of theological violence that denied existence itself to political enemies. The same temple includes scenes of Seti and his son Rameses performing religious duties with hands that the war reliefs show covered in enemy blood. There's no cognitive dissonance between the king as pious worshiper and brutal conqueror. Violence had been so thoroughly normalized that it required no justification or separation from sacred activities. Private tomb inscriptions from officials who served under Seti reveal the psychological effects of this normalized brutality. Unlike earlier periods when officials proudly recorded their military service in detail, Seti-era biographies use euphemistic language, accompanying His Majesty to distant lands, ensuring the king's will was fulfilled, maintaining proper order among foreign peoples. Even the perpetrators seemed to understand they were participating in something that required careful language. Foreign diplomatic correspondence from this period shows how Seti's artistic propaganda affected international relations. Hittite and Assyrian archives include references to Egyptian temple decorations that were deliberately shown to foreign ambassadors as demonstrations of what happened to enemies of Egypt. Art had become psychological warfare. The human cost becomes visible in the workers' villages that supported Seti's massive building projects. Deir el-Medina Ostraka from his reign include references to special workshops for processing foreign captives, skilled artisans forced to create monuments celebrating their own people's destruction. The irony was intentional. Enemy craftsmen were made to carve Egyptian triumphs over their homelands. But perhaps most revealing are the details preserved in tomb paintings of Seti's officials. These private monuments show Egyptian families enjoying luxury goods, fine textiles, exotic foods, precious metals, foreign servants, all flowing from the systematic exploitation of conquered territories. Violence wasn't just state policy. It was the economic foundation of upper-class Egyptian lifestyle. Medical papyri from Seti's reign describe new treatments for conditions that appear to be psychological trauma, insomnia, nervous disorders, what modern medicine would recognize as post-traumatic stress. Even the perpetrators of systematic violence were being damaged by their own brutality. But the royal artistic program transformed their suffering into aesthetic achievement. When Seti died, his body was mummified with unprecedented care and buried in the most beautiful tomb ever carved in the Valley of the Kings. But that tomb's exquisite decorations were purchased with the systematic destruction of entire communities across the ancient Near East. Beauty and horror were not opposites in Seti's Egypt. They were partners in an artistic program that used sublime craftsmanship to celebrate and normalize mass murder. His art was gentle, but his reign was not. And now the storm truly breaks with his son, who would perfect the marriage of propaganda and violence into something approaching industrial art. The colossi of Abu Simbel stare over the Nile like stone billboards, their carved faces advertising a victory that never happened. Inside the temple, reliefs covering every surface show Ramesses II single-handedly defeating the Hittite army at Kadesh, his chariot crushing enemies beneath divine wheels while gods cheer from above. The tourists snap photos of eternal triumph carved in granite. They don't know they're photographing the greatest lie ever told in stone. A near disaster rebranded as glorious victory through the ancient world's first industrial propaganda campaign. Ramesses II ruled Egypt for 66 years, from 1279 to 1213 BCE, earning the title Ramesses the Great from modern historians who bought into his own publicity campaign. His monuments dot Egypt like ancient billboards. Abu Simbel, the Ramesseum, additions to Karnak and Luxor temples, countless statues and obelisks proclaiming his military genius and divine favor. Popular culture remembers him as Egypt's greatest pharaoh, the builder king who secured borders and presided over an era of unprecedented prosperity. But the Battle of Kadesh, Ramesses' most celebrated triumph, was actually a military disaster that nearly cost him his life, his army, and his kingdom. Hittite records discovered in the 20th century provide an entirely different account of this supposedly decisive Egyptian victory. According to cuneiform tablets from Hattusa, the Hittite capital, the battle ended in stalemate with both sides exhausted and eager for peace. The Egyptian version, carved on temple walls across the kingdom, tells a dramatically different story. In Ramesses' account, preserved in the epic Poem of Pentar, the young pharaoh finds himself abandoned by cowardly troops and surrounded by 2,500 Hittite chariots. Through personal valor and divine intervention, he single-handedly routs the entire enemy army, killing thousands and forcing the Hittite king to beg for mercy. But the Hittite peace treaty, signed years after Kadesh and preserved in both Egyptian and Hittite versions, reveals the truth. The agreement establishes mutual defense, prisoner exchanges, and territorial boundaries that favor neither side, exactly what you'd expect from a stalemate, not Egyptian victory. More tellingly, the treaty refers to previous conflicts in language that suggests both sides were exhausted and economically devastated by prolonged warfare. Archaeological evidence supports the Hittite version. Excavations at Kadesh, modern Tel Nebi Mend in Syria, show evidence of a major battle, but no signs of decisive victory for either side. The site was apparently abandoned shortly after the conflict, suggesting both armies withdrew after suffering heavy casualties. Egyptian military equipment found at the site includes damaged chariots and weapons that show signs of hasty repair, not the gear of a victorious army. But Ramesses transformed near defeat into propaganda gold through the ancient world's first Boise comprehensive media campaign. The Kadesh battle account appears on at least 8 different temple complexes, countless smaller monuments, papyri, and even decorative objects. The story was told so often, in so many variations, that it became more real than the actual events. The propaganda machine required enormous resources. Ostraca from Deir el-Medina include work orders for scribes and artists specifically assigned to Kadesh commemoration projects. Teams of craftsmen spent decades carving the same fictional victory across Egypt's monumental landscape. The state was literally investing in alternate reality. Administrative papyri reveal the human cost of this propaganda campaign. The Wilbar papyrus documents massive labor conscription for Ramesses building projects, with entire villages required to provide workers for monument construction. The same papyrus includes ominous references to punishment for delay and correction of inadequate work, suggesting the artistic celebration of royal glory was built on forced labor managed through violence. Contemporary records from Deir el-Medina show the toll this took on Egypt's craftsmen. Medical papyri describe treatments for exhaustion, malnutrition, and injuries consistent with construction work. Some workers' tomb inscriptions include bitter complaints about impossible deadlines and inadequate rations, carefully worded to avoid direct criticism of royal projects. But perhaps most revealing are foreign diplomatic archives that show how Ramesses' propaganda affected international relations. Assyrian records include mocking references to Egyptian stone lies and express bewilderment at Egypt's insistence on celebrating defeats as victories. Egypt's credibility in international affairs was collapsing under the weight of its own fictional narratives. The ultimate irony is that Ramesses' greatest actual achievement, the peace treaty with the Hittites, received minimal monumental attention compared to the fictional Kadesh triumph. The treaty created decades of stability and prosperity, but apparently peace doesn't sell as well as imaginary military glory. Modern analysis of Ramesses' mummy reveals the physical toll of maintaining this propaganda empire. His body shows signs of stress-related conditions, dental problems, arthritis, cardiovascular disease. Even the pharaoh was being consumed by the machinery of his own myth-making. Ramesses didn't win Kadesh. He owned the printing press, and his successors would inherit both his monuments and the impossible standard they set. When reality can't match the royal narrative, the solution isn't better reality. It's bigger monuments and louder lies. He didn't just rule Egypt. He invented the concept of alternative facts carved in stone, proving that the biggest lies require the most expensive monuments and the most persistent repetition. Granaries stand half empty under a pitiless sun, while crowds of desperate petitioners press against palace gates, their children's ribs showing through papyrus-thin skin. Inside the royal compound, priests and officials feast on imported delicacies, while secretaries calculate grain distributions based not on need, but on loyalty. Welcome to Merimta's Egypt, where famine became a sorting mechanism and starvation became state policy, with the fortunate eating while the faithful died quietly in the desert. Merenptah ruled Egypt from 1213 to 1203 BCE as the 13th son and eventual successor of Ramesses II. Historical accounts generally portray him as a capable, if unremarkable, pharaoh who defended Egypt against invasions by the mysterious Sea Peoples and maintained order during a period of regional instability. His victory stele, famous for containing the first known reference to Israel in ancient records, presents him as a successful military commander who crushed foreign enemies and maintained Egyptian dominance. But that same victory stele reveals something darker between its lines of triumphant boasting. The inscription describes military campaigns against peoples who were not traditional enemies, but rather groups driven to desperation by widespread famine and ecological collapse. The Sea Peoples weren't invaders seeking conquest. They were refugees seeking survival, entire populations displaced by climate disasters that had made their homelands uninhabitable. Contemporary administrative papyri paint a picture of Egypt facing its own environmental crisis. The Anastasi papyri include references to low floods, failed harvests, and hungry seasons that stretched across multiple years. The Nile's annual flood, which sustained Egyptian agriculture, was failing with increasing frequency, creating food shortages that threatened the kingdom's stability. But instead of distributing scarce resources equitably, Meremptah's administration implemented a policy of selective starvation. Temple records from Memphis show grain allocations prioritizing religious institutions, military units, and loyal officials, while provincial populations received increasingly meager rations. The bureaucracy had turned famine into a tool for ensuring political obedience. Archaeological evidence from workers' villages dating to this period shows the devastating effects of this policy. Skeletal analysis from Deir el-Medina reveals increased rates of malnutrition, growth stunting in children, and diseases associated with protein deficiency. Even the elite craftsmen who built royal tombs were slowly starving while carving monuments to royal glory. The most disturbing evidence comes from provincial sites, where mass graves contain bodies showing signs of violent death mixed with starvation. These weren't battlefield casualties or criminal executions. They were apparently victims of food riots that were suppressed with military force. Contemporary ostraka include orders for troops to maintain order in grain distribution zones and prevent unauthorized gathering around storage facilities. Foreign diplomatic correspondence reveals how Egypt's internal crisis affected international relations. Letters from Hittite and Assyrian archives describe Egyptian attempts to purchase grain from neighboring kingdoms. But these negotiations often collapsed when Egypt couldn't provide adequate payment. The kingdom that had once dominated international trade was reduced to begging for food aid. But the most chilling aspect of Meremptah's reign was how famine was weaponized against domestic opposition. The Israel stele that made him famous includes boastful references to destroying not just military forces, but entire populations. Israel is laid waste, his seed is not. This language suggests systematic genocide disguised as military victory. Administrative records from border fortresses show how this policy was implemented. Guards were instructed to monitor population movements, preventing hungry Egyptians from fleeing to more stable regions, while also blocking refugees from entering Egypt. The borders became filters designed to contain suffering rather than alleviate it. Contemporary papyri describe the psychological effects of systematic starvation on Egyptian society. Medical texts reference new treatments for despair sickness and hunger madness, conditions that modern analysis suggests were clinical depression and psychosis caused by prolonged malnutrition. The kingdom was literally losing its mind from hunger. Religious texts from this period show how official ideology adapted to justify mass suffering. Priests developed theological explanations for famine as divine punishment for insufficient devotion to royal authority. Starvation wasn't a policy failure. It was proof that the gods supported Meremptah's selective distribution of resources. Private tomb inscriptions from officials who served during this crisis reveal the moral corruption that famine enabled. Instead of the traditional emphasis on justice and care for the poor, these biographies boast about maintaining personal wealth during difficult times and ensuring family security through proper relationships with royal administrators. But perhaps most revealing are inventory records from royal banquets during the famine years. While common Egyptians survived on bread and water, palace menus included imported wine, exotic meats, and luxury foods that required enormous resources to obtain. The contrast was intentional. Royal abundance demonstrated divine favor, while popular suffering proved the gods' displeasure with disobedience. When Meremptah died, Egypt had survived its environmental crisis, but lost something harder to replace: the social contract between ruler and ruled. His reign had established a precedent that would haunt Egyptian politics for centuries: the idea that royal survival trumped popular welfare, that loyalty could be purchased through selective access to basic necessities. His greatest monument is a brag about destruction carved on stone. But his real legacy was the transformation of starvation from natural disaster into administrative policy, proving that scarcity breeds cruelty when those in power decide who deserves to eat. Night falls over the bureaucracy as lamplight flickers across papyri stamped with royal seals. In the shadows, a foreign-born official whispers new decrees into existence, for a price. Chancellor Bey, a man whose origins lie somewhere in the Levant, has discovered something remarkable. When a pharaoh is weak, the state becomes a marketplace where authority can be bought, sold, and counterfeited like any other commodity. Seti II ruled Egypt from approximately 1203–1197 BCE, officially recognized as the rightful successor to Merenptah during the declining years of the 19th dynasty. Traditional accounts present him as a legitimate pharaoh who maintained royal authority during a period of increasing instability, though his reign was marked by civil unrest and economic difficulties that would eventually contribute to the dynasty's collapse. But the real power during Seti II's reign belonged to Chancellor Bey, whose meteoric rise from obscurity to effective control of the Egyptian state represents one of history's most successful bureaucratic coups. Papyrus Salt, Vahuen Dapa Ahun 24, and related administrative documents reveal how a foreign opportunist systematically captured the machinery of government, while the nominal pharaoh retreated into ceremonial irrelevance. Bey's surviving correspondence reads like a manual for institutional capture. He began by identifying bottlenecks in the royal bureaucracy, positions where a single official could delay or approve crucial decisions. Through carefully placed bribes, strategic marriages, and elimination of rivals, Bey gradually positioned his associates in these key roles until he controlled the flow of information reaching the pharaoh. The process was elegant in its simplicity. Petitioners quickly learned that decisions weren't made in the throne room, but in Bey's private offices, where justice was dispensed based on payment rather than merit. Administrative papyri from this period show a kingdom effectively running on a subscription model. Access to royal favor required ongoing financial contributions to Bey's network. Contemporary foreign correspondence reveals how this corruption affected Egypt's international standing. Letters from Assyrian and Hittite courts express bewilderment at Egyptian diplomatic inconsistency, with treaties negotiated by Bey's agents often contradicting official royal policy. Foreign ambassadors stopped bothering to present credentials to the pharaoh, conducting all serious business directly with the chancellor. Archaeological evidence from this period shows the physical decay of royal authority. Construction projects initiated under Seti II's name were frequently abandoned mid-construction, with workers reassigned to private projects for Bey and his associates. The pharaoh's own tomb in the Valley of the Kings shows signs of hasty, inferior workmanship. Even royal burial preparations were being subcontracted to the lowest bidder. But perhaps most revealing are the loyalty oaths, preserved in administrative papyri from Bey's regime. Officials were required to swear allegiance not just to the pharaoh, but specifically to His Majesty and the chancellor who speaks for him. The formula made explicit what everyone already knew. Real authority lay with the man who controlled access to the throne. Private tomb inscriptions from this period show how Egyptian elites adapted to the new reality. Instead of traditional biographical formulas emphasizing service to the pharaoh, these texts carefully describe service to proper authority and those who maintain order, language that allowed officials to hedge their bets about which regime would ultimately survive. The human cost was enormous. With royal authority effectively privatized, local disputes escalated into regional conflicts as communities lost faith in central justice. Tax collection became indistinguishable from extortion, with Bey's agents extracting tribute from areas they had never legally administered. Egypt was being harvested like a conquered territory by its own bureaucracy. Medical papyri from this period describe increasing rates of stress-related illness among the remaining legitimate officials who struggled to maintain government function while working around Bey's corruption network. The state itself was developing symptoms of institutional breakdown. When Seti II finally died, the kingdom he left behind was a hollow shell held together by personal relationships and financial arrangements rather than law or tradition. Bey had proven that divine kingship was just another business model, one that could be franchised to anyone with sufficient capital and administrative skill. Egypt wasn't ruled, it was brokered, and brokered kingdoms are always for sale to the highest bidder. Masons work through the night at Thebes, chiseling away Seti II's cartouches and carving fresh names over the defaced stone. Somewhere to the north, other craftsmen perform the same ritual in reverse, erasing Amenmes's claims while restoring his rival's titles. Egypt has two pharaohs now, each claiming divine authority, each erasing the other's existence. Civil war has become an editing contest, waged with chisels and hammers across the kingdom's monumental landscape. Amenmese ruled as pharaoh for approximately 4 years during the late 19th dynasty, though his exact relationship to Seti II and the circumstances of his rise remain debated. Traditional chronologies treat him as either a brief usurper or a legitimate claimant whose reign was later suppressed, but the archaeological evidence reveals something more complex. A kingdom literally divided between competing royal authorities. The evidence lies carved in stone across Egypt's monuments. At Karnak Temple, relief scenes show systematic alteration of royal cartouches, with different names carved over the same inscriptions in multiple phases. Microscopic analysis reveals the sequence: original inscriptions for Seti II's, altered to show Amenmese, then modified again to restore Seti's name. Egypt's sacred architecture had become a battlefield, where divine authority was carved and recarved with each shift in political control. Contemporary papyri reveal the administrative chaos this created. Tax records from Upper Egypt show payments made to His Majesty Amenmese, while documents from Lower Egypt record tribute to His Majesty Seti. Provincial officials received contradictory orders from competing royal bureaucracies, forcing local administrators to make impossible choices about which pharaoh to recognize. The Theban tombs of officials who lived through this period show the human cost of divided loyalty. Biographical inscriptions carefully avoid mentioning either king by name, instead describing service to His Majesty or the good God, without specifying which royal claimant they meant. These officials were writing their own obituaries in code, trying to survive whichever pharaoh ultimately prevailed. Archaeological evidence suggests the kingdom was effectively partitioned, with Amenmese controlling southern Egypt from Thebes, while Seti II maintained authority in the north from Memphis. Each ruler established parallel administrative systems, appointed competing officials to the same positions, and issued contradictory decrees affecting the same territories. Foreign diplomatic archives from this period reveal the international confusion Egypt's civil war created. Assyrian correspondence refers to negotiations with the southern pharaoh and the northern pharaoh, as if they were rulers of different kingdoms. Egypt's enemies were learning that divine kingship could be duplicated, making it far less impressive as a diplomatic tool. The most disturbing evidence comes from the workers' village at Deir el-Medina, where Ostraca record the craftsman's impossible situation. Royal tomb construction continued for both claimants simultaneously, with the same workers required to create burial preparations for competing pharaohs. Some Ostraca include bitter complaints about carving for enemies and preparing tombs for false kings. Private letters from this period describe families torn apart by competing loyalties. Brothers served different pharaohs, fathers and sons found themselves on opposite sides of the civil war, and marriages were broken by political allegiances. The personal had become political, and the political had become deadly. But perhaps most revealing are the later attempts to resolve this historical embarrassment. Subsequent pharaohs tried to edit both claimants from the official record, creating chronological gaps and inconsistencies that confused ancient historians and continue to puzzle modern Egyptologists. The very existence of competing pharaohs threatened the theological foundation of Egyptian kingship. When the civil war finally ended, Egypt had learned a dangerous lesson. Divine authority could be counterfeited convincingly enough to fool subjects, allies, and enemies alike. The god-king was revealed as a political construct rather than cosmic reality, and once that knowledge existed, it could never be completely suppressed. The kingdom survived Amenmese's usurpation, but the precedent remained. When legitimacy was disputed, Egypt could literally tear itself in half, with each piece claiming to be the real kingdom and the other a blasphemous impostor. Queen Tausret's tomb in the Valley of the Kings tells a story of interrupted eternity. Wall paintings show the queen performing pharaonic duties with divine authority, but closer inspection reveals hasty modifications. Sarcophagus spaces reassigned, burial chambers repurposed, decorative programs altered mid-execution. History was being rewritten in real time, as the last ruler of the 19th dynasty discovered that even death offered no refuge from political assassination. Tausret ruled as pharaoh for approximately 7 years, from around 1191–1184 BCE, making her one of the few women to hold full pharaonic authority in Egyptian history. She initially served as regent for the young king Siptah, then claimed royal titles in her own right after his death. Official accounts present her as the legitimate last ruler of the 19th dynasty, followed by Setnakht's peaceful foundation of the 20th dynasty. But Setnakht's own accession inscriptions tell a very different story. His victory stela at Elephantine celebrates his triumph over the rebellious enemy and claims he established Egypt after it had been demolished by unnamed enemies. The language suggests not peaceful succession, but violent overthrow, with Tausret cast as a usurper whose reign represented chaos rather than legitimate rule. Archaeological evidence from Tausret's tomb, KV-14, reveals the brutal reality behind these euphemistic inscriptions. The queen's burial preparations were systematically vandalized and repurposed for Setnakht's use. Her sarcophagus was removed, her wall decorations altered to show the new pharaoh, and her burial goods redistributed to support his funeral preparations. Even in death, she was being erased from Egyptian history. Contemporary administrative papier showed the kingdom-wide purge that followed Setnakht's victory. Officials who had served Tausret were systematically dismissed, imprisoned, or simply disappeared from the records. Entire bureaucratic departments were dissolved and reconstituted under new leadership, loyal to the 20th dynasty. The transition wasn't administrative reform, it was political revenge. Foreign correspondence preserved in Assyrian archives provides an outside perspective on Egypt's internal chaos. Diplomatic letters describe Egyptian envoys arriving with contradictory credentials, some claiming to represent Queen Tausret, while others insisted Setnakht was the rightful pharaoh. Egypt's international credibility collapsed as foreign courts struggled to determine which Egyptian authority was legitimate. The most disturbing evidence comes from mass graves near Thebes containing bodies that show signs of execution-style killing. Forensic analysis suggests these victims died during the transition period between dynasties, with wound patterns consistent with systematic elimination of Tausret's supporters. Political transition had become demographic cleansing. Private tomb inscriptions from officials who survived the changeover reveal the terror that gripped Egypt's elite. These biographical texts carefully avoid any mention of service to Tausret, instead claiming continuous loyalty to proper authority and legitimate kingship. Survival required not just political flexibility, but historical amnesia. But perhaps most chilling are the religious justifications preserved in Setnakht's temple inscriptions. The new pharaoh's priests developed elaborate theological explanations for his violent takeover, claiming that Tausret's rule had violated divine law by allowing a woman to hold pharaonic authority. Her overthrow wasn't political, it was cosmic correction. The economic records from this period show the material cost of regime change. Royal workshops that had been producing goods for Tausret's burial and religious foundations were redirected to support Setnakht's projects. Craftsmen were forced to destroy their own work and begin again, creating monuments to the king who had murdered their previous patron. Later, Egyptian historians struggled to explain this chaotic transition. Some accounts simply omit Tausret's reign entirely, jumping directly from Siptah to Setnakhte, as if the female pharaoh had never existed. Others describe her as a regent who never claimed full royal authority, despite clear archaeological evidence of her pharaonic titles and independent rule. The 19th dynasty didn't end with ceremony. It imploded under the weight of personal ambition and theological contradiction. Setnakht had proven that even the most sacred aspects of kingship could be violated if the perpetrator was willing to kill enough witnesses and rewrite enough monuments. The last rulers of the dynasty fought not for Egypt, but for survival, and the dynasty's end came not through foreign invasion, but domestic assassination conducted with religious justification. The walls of Medinet Habu roar with carved images of Ramesses III crushing the sea peoples, his divine strength triumphing over chaos itself. But in a chamber hidden for millennia, CT scanners reveal what those magnificent reliefs could never admit: a throat slash so deeply it nearly severed the pharaoh's head from his body. The last great warrior king of Egypt died not in glorious battle, but in a palace bedroom, murdered by his own family in history's most thoroughly documented royal assassination. Ramesses III ruled Egypt from 1186-1155 BCE, and conventional history celebrates him as the last pharaoh of imperial greatness. His victory over the Sea Peoples supposedly saved Egyptian civilization from destruction, while his building programs at Medinet Habu created some of the most spectacular temple art in ancient Egypt. Modern accounts present his reign as a successful defensive campaign that preserved Egypt's independence during a period of regional collapse. But the judicial papyrus of Turin preserves a very different story, one of palace intrigue, so Byzantine it reads like a modern conspiracy thriller. The document, discovered in the 19th century, records the trial proceedings for what ancient sources called the harem conspiracy, a multi-layered assassination plot that reached into the highest levels of Egyptian government and royal family. The conspiracy centered on Tiye, one of Ramesses III's secondary wives, who sought to place her son, Prince Pentower, on the throne instead of the designated heir. But this wasn't a simple succession dispute. The plot involved dozens of co-conspirators, including royal butlers, treasury officials, military commanders, and even the overseer of cattle. The assassination had been planned like a military campaign, with participants recruited from across the royal administration. Contemporary forensic analysis of Ramesses III's mummy, conducted using advanced CT scanning, reveals wounds that confirm the papyrus accounts. The pharaoh suffered a massive throat wound that severed his trachea and major blood vessels, a killing blow that would have caused rapid death through blood loss and asphyxiation. Additional analysis found a small amulet placed against the wound during mummification, suggesting the embalmers recognized the traumatic nature of his death. But the conspiracy trials reveal something even more disturbing than regicide: the systematic use of magic as a weapon of political assassination. The judicial papyrus describes conspirators creating wax figures of the pharaoh and performing ritual curses designed to weaken his divine protection. Ancient Egypt had weaponized sympathetic magic, turning religious practice into a tool for political murder. The punishment of the conspirators reads like a catalog of creative brutality. Some were forced to commit suicide, others had their noses and ears cut off before execution, and several were burned alive. Prince Pentower, the intended beneficiary of the plot, was apparently forced to hang himself in his prison cell. But the trials also reveal how deeply the conspiracy had penetrated the royal household. Dozens of officials who had daily access to the pharaoh were involved in planning his death. Archaeological evidence from Ramesses III's tomb and mortuary temple suggests the assassination succeeded, despite elaborate security precautions. The pharaoh's burial preparations show signs of hasty completion, with some wall decorations left unfinished and burial goods assembled from existing royal stocks rather than specially manufactured items. Egypt's most powerful king had been reduced to a rush job and death. Foreign diplomatic correspondence from this period shows how the assassination affected Egypt's international standing. Assyrian and Babylonian archives include references to Egyptian internal difficulties and canceled diplomatic missions. Egypt's enemies were learning that even the most successful pharaohs were vulnerable to domestic betrayal. But perhaps most chilling is evidence that the harem conspiracy wasn't an isolated incident. Administrative papyri from Ramesses III's reign include references to increased security measures, loyalty oaths required from palace staff, and systematic surveillance of royal family members. The pharaoh was living under siege in his own palace, surrounded by potential assassins wearing the faces of trusted servants and beloved relatives. Even a god king could bleed, and when he did, the whole kingdom hemorrhaged with him, proving that divine authority was only as strong as the human throat that proclaimed it. The workers of Deir el-Medina sit with their tools untouched, refusing to enter the Valley of the Kings for the third consecutive day. Their grievance is simple and devastating. They haven't been paid in months. Behind them, the half-finished tomb of Ramesses IV gapes like an open wound in the limestone, while above them, the pharaoh's mortuary temple crumbles from neglect. Welcome to the world's first recorded labor strike, where the men who built eternity discovered that even gods can run out of money. The later Ramesside pharaohs, Ramesses IV through 50, ruled Egypt from approximately 1155 to 1077 BCA, during what historians call the decline of the New Kingdom. Official accounts present this period as a time of gradual weakening due to external pressures, invasions by sea peoples, economic competition from rising powers, natural disasters that disrupted agricultural production. The traditional narrative suggests these pharaohs struggled valiantly against forces beyond their control, but the Turin Strike Papyrus tells a more damning story. This remarkable document, dating to the reign of Ramesses III's successors, records the first known organized labor action in human history. The royal tomb builders, Egypt's most skilled and trusted craftsmen, simply stopped working when their food rations failed to arrive. Their demands were brutally simple. "We are hungry. Give us our provisions." The strike wasn't a spontaneous outburst, but a carefully organized protest that revealed sophisticated understanding of labor leverage. The workers knew that pharaonic afterlife depended on completed tombs, making their skills irreplaceable and their cooperation essential. They had discovered that even god-kings were vulnerable to unemployment tactics. Administrative papyri from this period reveal the economic chaos behind the labor troubles. Government granaries were systematically emptied to fund military campaigns and royal building projects, leaving insufficient reserves for routine operations. The state was consuming its own infrastructure, cannibalizing basic services to maintain the appearance of imperial power. But the strikes were only the beginning. The Abbott Papyrus and related documents describe systematic tomb robberies that turned royal burial sites into mining operations. Thieves, often including the very guards charged with protecting the tombs, systematically stripped royal mummies of gold, jewelry, and precious materials. The afterlife had become a commodity market. The tomb robbery trials preserve testimony that reads like confessions from professional criminals. One thief describes removing gold, silver, and precious stones from royal mummies, then burning the bodies to hide evidence of desecration. Another confesses to using stolen royal gold to purchase houses and livestock, transforming sacred burial goods into personal wealth. Contemporary papyri reveal how deeply corruption had penetrated Egyptian institutions. Local officials accepted bribes to ignore tomb robbing, priests sold information about burial locations, and even royal family members participated in looting their ancestors' graves. The boundary between law enforcement and organized crime had completely dissolved. Foreign correspondence from this period shows how Egypt's internal collapse affected international relations. Assyrian archives include mocking references to Egyptian diplomatic gifts that were obviously stolen goods, recycled royal regalia being offered as tribute by a kingdom that could no longer afford new luxury items. Archaeological evidence from the Valley of the Kings confirms the papyrus accounts. Royal tombs show systematic signs of ancient robbery, smashed sarcophagi, stripped mummies, wall decorations hacked away for their gold leaf. The eternal resting places of Egypt's greatest pharaohs had been converted into scrap metal operations. But perhaps most revealing are the royal mummy caches discovered in the 19th and 20th centuries. These hidden burial sites contain dozens of royal mummies, hastily rewrapped and concealed by priests who were trying to protect the remaining pharaohs from further desecration. Even death had become unsafe for Egyptian royalty. The later Ramesside period established a pattern that would haunt Egyptian politics for centuries. When central authority weakened, everyone grabbed what they could. Workers demanded payment, officials demanded bribes, thieves demanded access, and priests demanded protection money. The kingdom that had once terrified foreign empires was reduced to a protection racket run by its own civil servants. When the workers stopped fearing the king, the age is over. And into that vacuum stepped men in white linen who understood that religious authority was more durable than political power. Karnak Temple at Dawn reveals the new reality of Egyptian power. No pharaoh processes through the hypostyle hall, only high priests wearing crowns that rival royal regalia, wielding authority that surpasses distant kings. In the shadows of the great temple complex, priests count tribute, assign land grants, and issue decrees with the confidence of men who have discovered that controlling the gods means controlling everything else. Welcome to Egypt's first theocracy, where white linen robes concealed the same dark appetites that had always driven royal power. During the 21st dynasty and Third Intermediate period, roughly 1077–943 BCE, Egypt experienced a unique form of government that historians often describe euphemistically as shared rule between pharaohs and priests. Traditional accounts present this as a peaceful accommodation between religious and secular authority, with high priests of Amun exercising local control in Upper Egypt, while pharaohs maintained nominal oversight from northern capitals. But archaeological evidence reveals a more sinister reality. The same mechanisms of exclusion, elimination, and terror that characterize pharaonic rule had simply changed costume. The high priests of Amun didn't share power. They seized it completely, using religious authority to justify political control more absolute than most pharaohs had ever exercised. Administrative papyri from Thebes during this period show high priests issuing decrees with fully royal language. His Holiness has decreed, by the will of Amun through his servant, may the god grant life to those who obey. These weren't religious pronouncements, but political orders backed by divine sanction, making resistance not just treasonous, but blasphemous. The Wilbur Papyrus documents massive land transfers during the early Third Intermediate period, with temple estates expanding to control vast agricultural territories. But these acquisitions weren't peaceful purchases. They were systematic confiscations justified by religious law. Families who had owned land for generations suddenly found themselves landless, their property donated to Amun through forced sales at symbolic prices. Contemporary letters preserved in temple archives reveal the human cost of theocratic rule. Provincial officials wrote desperate appeals for tax relief, describing communities devastated by temple demands for tribute, labor, and raw materials. The language is carefully respectful. No one dared openly criticize religious authority. But the suffering is obvious between the lines. Archaeological evidence from Theban burial sites shows how priestly power was enforced. Mass graves from this period contain bodies showing signs of violent death. Crushed skulls, broken bones, wounds consistent with public execution. These weren't foreign enemies, but Egyptian civilians whose deaths coincided with periods of increased temple taxation and land confiscation. But perhaps most disturbing are the mummy, caches that reveal how priests literally controlled the dead. Royal mummies from earlier dynasties were systematically unwrapped, stripped of valuable grave goods, and rewrapped in cheaper materials. The priests weren't just robbing tombs, they were harvesting royal corpses like a renewable resource, selling access to pharaonic afterlife services. Foreign diplomatic correspondence from this period shows how theocratic rule affected Egypt's international standing. Assyrian and Libyan archives describe negotiations with Egyptian temple kings, whose authority seemed to shift unpredictably based on religious calendar and priestly politics. Egypt had become diplomatically incomprehensible to societies with conventional government structures. Private tomb inscriptions from officials who served under priestly rule reveal the climate of religious terror this system created. These biographies carefully emphasize personal piety, temple donations, and ritual observances while avoiding any mention of secular achievements or independent thinking. Success required not just competence, but visible devotion to the temple hierarchy. Medical papyri from Thebes describe increasing rates of mental illness during this period, with treatments for conditions that modern medicine would recognize as anxiety disorders and depression. The population was literally being driven insane by religious micromanagement of daily life. The most chilling evidence comes from judicial papyri that describe purification trials for suspected religious dissidents. These proceedings used torture to extract confessions of impiety, heresy, and insufficient devotion to Amun. The trials weren't seeking justice. They were manufacturing orthodoxy through systematic terror. The costume changed from gold to white linen, but the hands beneath remained just as blood-stained, proving that religious authority could be just as ruthless as political power when backed by divine sanction. At Bubastis, relief carvings show Shoshenq towering over endless lists of conquered cities, each hieroglyph representing a community stripped of its treasures. The pharaoh's divine feet trample miniature fortresses, while scribes tally the human and material inventory flowing back to Egypt. But this isn't conquest. It's armed robbery disguised as foreign policy. The systematic looting of neighboring kingdoms by a declining empire desperate to maintain the illusion of greatness. Shoshenq. Yaowenj. I ruled Egypt from approximately 943–922 BCE, founding the 22nd dynasty with Libyan origins that marked the end of purely Egyptian pharaonic rule. Biblical sources know him as Shishak, the pharaoh who invaded Judah during the reign of King Rehoboam and stripped Jerusalem's temple of its treasures. Egyptologists often present his reign as a successful reassertion of Egyptian power abroad after the fragmentation of the Third Intermediate Period. But the Bubastite portal at Karnak reveals the true nature of Shoshenq's diplomacy. The relief lists over 150 conquered sites in Palestine, but archaeological evidence suggests these weren't military victories so much as protection racket operations. The targeted communities show destruction patterns consistent with raids rather than occupation, hit-and-run operations designed to extract maximum wealth with minimum investment. Contemporary Assyrian correspondence describes Egyptian trade missions that arrived with suspiciously large military escorts and departed with unprecedented quantities of tribute. Foreign rulers learned to interpret Egyptian diplomatic visits as ransom demands, pay what the pharaoh wanted, or watch your cities burn while he took it anyway. The most damning evidence comes from Shoshenq's own administrative records, which treat foreign plunder as routine revenue. Palace accounts list Asiatic gold, Nubian ivory, and Levantine silver alongside domestic tax collections, making no distinction between legitimate tribute and stolen goods. Robbery had been bureaucratized into standard economic policy. Archaeological analysis of sites across the Levant shows the systematic nature of these operations. Egyptian forces targeted religious centers, royal treasuries, and merchant quarters, while leaving residential areas largely untouched. This wasn't random warfare. It was precision extraction designed to maximize portable wealth, while avoiding expensive occupation responsibilities. Foreign diplomatic archives reveal how neighboring kingdoms adapted to Egyptian extortion. Letters between Levantine rulers discuss Egyptian seasons, periods when Shoshenq's forces operated most actively, and strategies for hiding valuable goods during these vulnerable times. International trade networks had to factor in regular Egyptian piracy as a business expense. But perhaps most revealing are the Egyptian workers' villages that processed the incoming loot. Ostraca from these sites describe craftsmen whose job was purifying foreign gold and preparing Asiatic silver for royal use, euphemisms for melting down stolen religious artifacts and royal regalia to obscure their origins. Private tomb inscriptions from Shoshenq's officials boast about wealth acquired through accompanying His Majesty to foreign lands and ensuring proper tribute collection. The language carefully avoids describing actual military service, suggesting even the participants understood they were engaged in glorified theft rather than legitimate warfare. Egypt's decline had created a feedback loop of desperation and brutality. The weaker the kingdom became domestically, the more aggressively it preyed on its neighbors. Shoshenq's reign established a precedent that would haunt Egyptian foreign relations for centuries. When internal legitimacy failed, external violence became the only way to maintain royal authority and economic stability. War camps stretch across the Levantine landscape as two empires clash over the burning remains of smaller kingdoms. Egyptian and Assyrian banners mark territories measured in ash and unmarked graves, while local populations flee from armies that see civilians as military supplies to be consumed. Taharqa, the Kushite pharaoh, wages his anti-imperial campaign with the same scorched earth tactics that made his Assyrian enemies infamous, proving that resistance to brutality often requires matching it. Taharqa ruled Egypt from 690 to 64 BCE as part of the 25th dynasty, when Kushite kings from modern Sudan controlled both Egypt and Nubia. Modern historians often celebrate him as a heroic figure who resisted Assyrian expansion and defended Egyptian independence against foreign domination. His conflict with Assyrian kings like Sennacherib and Esarhaddon is presented as a noble struggle between African civilization and Mesopotamian imperialism. But Assyrian royal annals preserve a different perspective on Taharka's military methods. Cuneiform inscriptions from Nineveh describe Egyptian forces implementing systematic population displacement, forced relocations, and mass killings that matched or exceeded Assyrian brutality. The resistance wasn't more humane than the empire it opposed. It was competing in the same race to the bottom. Archaeological evidence from contested territories shows the human cost of this imperial rivalry. Excavations at sites like Lachish and Ekron reveal destruction layers associated with Egyptian campaigns that are indistinguishable from Assyrian devastation: burned buildings, mass graves, evidence of systematic looting and population removal. The victims couldn't tell their liberators from their oppressors. Contemporary records describe Taharka's forces employing tactics that deliberately targeted civilian populations to deny resources to Assyrian armies. Villages were burned not because they supported the enemy, but to prevent them from potentially supporting anyone. Entire communities were relocated to prevent Assyrian recruitment or taxation, with families separated and scattered across Egypt and Nubia. Foreign correspondence from smaller kingdoms caught between the empires reveals the impossible choices local rulers faced. Letters in Phoenician and Hebrew describe communities paying tribute to both sides, sending hostages to multiple courts, and watching their territories become battlegrounds where neither Egyptian nor Assyrian forces distinguish between allies and enemies. But perhaps most disturbing are Egyptian administrative documents that describe the processing of war refugees as new resources for royal projects. Displaced populations weren't being rescued. They were being harvested for forced labor, with families broken apart and individuals assigned to construction gangs, agricultural estates, or military units based on bureaucratic convenience rather than human relationships. Private inscriptions from Egyptian officials who participated in these campaigns describe the psychological toll of implementing policies that destroyed the very communities they claimed to be protecting. Some texts include appeals to gods for forgiveness, suggesting even the perpetrators recognize the moral bankruptcy of their methods. Taharka's resistance to Assyrian imperialism succeeded militarily but failed morally, proving that fighting monsters often requires becoming monstrous. His reign demonstrated that anti-imperial struggles could be just as devastating for ordinary people as the empires they opposed, leaving communities to choose between different forms of systematic oppression. The tragedy wasn't that he lost to the Assyrians, but that winning would have required methods indistinguishable from theirs. Banquet halls in the royal palace echo with forced laughter as nobles watch their host humiliate another guest, wine-soaked entertainment that doubles as political intimidation. Amasis, too, raises his cup in mock toast while a former rival begs for mercy, the assembled courtiers understanding that their own survival depends on laughing at the right moments and staying silent during the wrong ones. Welcome to Egypt's most charming reign of terror, where jokes became policy and parties became execution chambers. Mnesis II ruled Egypt from 570 to 526 BCE, and Greek historians like Herodotus generally present him as a colorful, even likable character, a former soldier who rose to power through populist appeal and maintained authority through wit, wisdom, and democratic sensibilities. His reign supposedly represented a golden age of Egyptian independence before Persian conquest, marked by prosperity, religious tolerance, and diplomatic success. But those same classical sources preserve disturbing details about Amasis's methods that reveal systematic cruelty disguised as entertainment. Herodotus describes the pharaoh's fondness for public humiliation of nobles, forced marriages that destroyed aristocratic alliances, and confiscation of estates through manufactured legal proceedings that he turned into spectacles for popular amusement. Administrative papyri from Amasis's reign show the bureaucratic infrastructure behind his populist authoritarianism. Land redistribution wasn't democratic reform, but strategic punishment of potential rivals, with estates seized from wealthy families and redistributed to loyal supporters. The policy created a new aristocracy completely dependent on royal favor while destroying traditional power centers. Contemporary Greek accounts describe Amasis' court as a theater of calculated unpredictability, where survival depended on reading the pharaoh's moods correctly. Officials never knew whether a royal summons meant promotion, humiliation, or execution, creating a climate of constant anxiety that prevented organized opposition while ensuring absolute obedience. Archaeological evidence from palace sites shows systematic modification of traditional court protocols. Throne rooms were redesigned for public spectacles, with elevated platforms that allowed larger audiences to witness royal entertainments. These weren't casual social gatherings, but carefully orchestrated demonstrations of arbitrary power. Foreign diplomatic correspondence reveals how Amasis' domestic methods affected international relations. Greek merchants and diplomats describe Egyptian court ceremonies where foreign representatives were forced to participate in degradation rituals disguised as hospitality, with commercial agreements contingent on accepting public humiliation as proof of submission. But perhaps most chilling are private tomb inscriptions from nobles who survived Amasis' reign. These texts carefully avoid describing court service in detail, instead emphasizing personal piety, family relationships, and non-political achievements. The silence is telling. Even decades later, survivors were afraid to document what they had experienced. Medical papyri from this period describe treatments for conditions that modern medicine would recognize as stress-related disorders, insomnia, digestive problems, nervous exhaustion. The Egyptian elite was literally being sickened by the psychological pressure of serving a pharaoh who had turned unpredictability into statecraft. Amasis' reign proved that authoritarian control didn't require overt brutality when psychological manipulation was more effective. His charm was a blade with wine on it, and his populist appeal masked the same appetite for absolute control that had always characterized Egyptian kingship. The sacred Apis bull lies dying in the courtyard of the Serapeum, its divine blood pooling in sand, while Egyptian priests watch in horror from behind Persian spears. Cambyses II, the foreign king who claims pharaonic titles, walks away from the wounded god with the casual indifference of a man for whom Egyptian religion is just local superstition to be managed through intimidation. This isn't conquest, it's theological warfare, the systematic humiliation of a civilization through the desecration of everything it holds sacred. Cambyses II ruled Egypt as Persian pharaoh from 525–522 BCE after his father, Cyrus the Great, conquered the country and incorporated it into the Achaemenid Empire. Persian administrative efficiency generally allowed local customs to continue under imperial oversight, and some modern historians present Cambyses as a legitimate pharaoh who adapted Persian rule to Egyptian expectations while maintaining religious and cultural traditions. But Greek sources, particularly Herodotus, preserve accounts of systematic religious persecution that reveal Cambyses' contempt for Egyptian civilization. The killing or wounding of the sacred Apis bull, whether deliberate or accidental, violated the most fundamental principles of Egyptian theology, striking at the heart of beliefs that had sustained the culture for millennia. Contemporary Egyptian sources, where they survive, describe temple closures, confiscation of religious endowments, and persecution of priests who refused to acknowledge Persian authority over sacred matters. Administrative papyri from this period show systematic reorganization of religious institutions, with traditional ceremonies canceled or modified to emphasize Persian rather than Egyptian divine authority. Archaeological evidence from major temple sites shows physical destruction dating to the early Persian period. Smashed statuary, defaced reliefs, systematically vandalized religious artwork. This wasn't random damage, but coordinated assault on Egyptian cultural identity, designed to break the spiritual foundations of potential resistance. Elephantine papyri reveal how Persian rule affected daily religious practice. Local temples were required to obtain Persian permission for traditional festivals, with celebrations modified or canceled based on imperial convenience rather than religious calendar. Sacred rituals that had continued for centuries were suddenly subject to foreign bureaucratic approval. But perhaps most devastating was the psychological impact of religious humiliation. Egyptian theology made no distinction between attacking the gods and attacking the people who worshipped them. Desecrating divine images was equivalent to assaulting Egyptian souls. Cambyses had discovered that cultural destruction was more effective than military occupation for breaking a civilization's will to resist. Foreign correspondence from this period shows how other Persian satrapies viewed the Egyptian experiment. Administrative letters describe special protocols for managing Egyptian religious sensibilities, suggesting that the level of theological persecution in Egypt exceeded Persian practices elsewhere in the empire. Private documents from Egyptian families during this period reveal the deep trauma of watching their gods degraded by foreign rulers who treated sacred rituals as administrative inconveniences. Some texts include desperate appeals to deities who no longer seemed capable of protecting their own temples, let alone their worshippers. Cambyses had learned that conquest wasn't complete until the conquered people's relationship with their gods had been severed, leaving them spiritually as well as politically orphaned. The cliff face at Behistun tells its story in 3 languages and rivers of carved blood. Darius IV towers above a line of bound rebels, their names and punishments cataloged with the precision of a tax assessment. Each figure represents thousands of deaths, entire populations eliminated with administrative efficiency that turned genocide into paperwork. This is what imperial order looks like when managed by accountants. Systematic murder documented in duplicate and carved in stone for eternity. Darius the Bishite ruled the Persian Empire from 522–486 BCE, governing Egypt as one satrap in a vast administrative network that stretched from India to Greece. Historical accounts generally present him as the great organizer of Persian imperial system, the king who created efficient governance structures, standardized taxation, and established the infrastructure that allowed the Achaemenid Empire to function across unprecedented distances and cultural diversity. But the Behistun inscription reveals the violence that underwrote Persian administrative efficiency. Carved into a cliff face in modern Iran, this trilingual monument catalogues Darius's suppression of rebellions across the empire with bureaucratic precision. I captured this one, I impaled that one, I flayed the other alive. The text reads like an execution inventory, with specific punishments listed alongside geographic locations and victim counts. Egyptian administrative papyri from Darius's reign show how this systematic violence was implemented at the satrapal level. Tax collection was backed by explicit threats of mutilation, execution, and collective punishment for communities that failed to meet quotas. Local officials were required to maintain detailed records of punishment types and frequencies, creating archives of terror that functioned as both administrative tools and psychological weapons. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Persian Empire confirms the Behistun accounts. Mass graves, execution grounds, and specialized torture facilities dating to Darius's reign show standardized methods for processing political dissidents. The Persians had industrialized political murder, creating templates that could be implemented consistently across diverse cultural contexts. Contemporary Greek accounts describe Egyptian rebellions during this period that were suppressed with unprecedented brutality. Entire cities were reportedly depopulated, their inhabitants killed or relocated to prevent future resistance. The Persian response to political opposition wasn't negotiation or accommodation. It was demographic surgery designed to permanently remove problematic populations. But perhaps most chilling was how this violence was integrated into routine administration. Persian satrapal reports include casualty figures alongside harvest data and trade statistics, treating human deaths as just another category of imperial resource management. Murder had become a cost of doing business, calculated, and budgeted like any other administrative expense. Foreign diplomatic correspondence reveals how Darius's methods affected international relations. Tributary kingdoms learned that Persian protection came with detailed requirements for demonstrating submission, including public acknowledgement of imperial execution rights over local populations. Sovereignty had become conditional on accepting Persian authority to kill subjects at will. Private documents from Egyptian families describe the psychological impact of living under systematized terror. Daily life required constant awareness of imperial surveillance and punishment protocols, with survival dependent on avoiding any behavior that might be interpreted as disloyalty or resistance. Darius had proven that cruelty became most effective when it was systematized, standardized, and scaled across imperial distances. turning individual brutality into administrative policy. Smoke curls from the sacred precincts of Memphis as Persian soldiers systematically strip gold leaf from temple walls, their torches reducing 3 millennia of religious art to ash and memory. Xerxes. I watches from his portable throne, unmoved by the wailing of priests whose gods are being fed to imperial furnaces. This isn't conquest, it's cultural extinction, the deliberate murder of a civilization's soul conducted with the methodical precision of a military engineering project. Xerxes I ruled Egypt as part of the Persian Empire from 486–465 BCE, inheriting control from his father Darius after Egyptian revolts had tested imperial authority. Classical sources present his reign as a period of harsh repression following unsuccessful Egyptian attempts at independence, with traditional accounts focusing on his famous campaigns against Greece rather than his administration of conquered territories. But Egyptian sources, where they survive, describe systematic religious persecution that went far beyond political suppression. Temple closures weren't temporary security measures, but permanent destruction of Egypt's spiritual infrastructure. Sacred sites that had operated continuously for thousands of years were shuttered, their endowments confiscated, their priests scattered or killed. Administrative papyri from this period reveal the bureaucratic machinery behind cultural genocide. Persian officials compiled detailed inventories of temple wealth, gold, silver, precious stones, religious artifacts, before systematically looting sacred treasuries that had accumulated donations from pharaohs spanning centuries. Religious persecution had become a revenue stream. Archaeological evidence from major temple complexes shows coordinated destruction dating to Xerxes' reign. At Karnak, Luxor, and Memphis, Persian forces didn't just damage religious buildings. They systematically dismantled the theological infrastructure that sustained Egyptian identity. Statues were not just toppled, but ground to powder, ensuring they could never be restored. Contemporary records describe the psychological warfare behind this religious destruction. Egyptian festivals were banned not just as security risks, but as assertions of cultural independence that challenged Persian supremacy. Traditional ceremonies that had marked agricultural cycles and community life for millennia were criminalized, leaving Egyptians spiritually orphaned in their own homeland. Foreign correspondence from other Persian satrapies reveals that Egypt received uniquely harsh treatment. Administrative letters describe special protocols for Egyptian management that exceeded standard imperial policies elsewhere. Xerxes had apparently concluded that Egyptian civilization was too dangerous to be merely conquered. It needed to be eradicated. Private documents from Egyptian families reveal the devastating impact of systematic cultural destruction. Household religious practices that had connected families to their ancestors and gods were driven underground, creating a generation of Egyptians who practiced their own traditions in secret like criminals hiding from imperial surveillance. But perhaps most chilling are Persian administrative reports that describe the religious persecution as successful policy. Official correspondence celebrates the pacification of Egyptian superstition and the elimination of resistance infrastructure, treating cultural genocide as an achieved military objective rather than a moral catastrophe. Xerxes had proven that destroying a people's relationship with their gods was more effective than killing their bodies, leaving them alive but spiritually dead, unable to imagine resistance when they could no longer imagine their own divine worth. Sidon's harbor burns like a vision of hell as desperate families choose death over Persian capture, leaping into flames that consume both their bodies and their city's independence. The smoke carries the screams of thousands while Artaxerxes III watches from his command post, calculating the psychological impact on other rebellious territories. This isn't suppressing revolt, it's advertising terror, using one city's agony to purchase submission from 100 others through the currency of documented horror. Artaxerxes III ruled the Persian Empire from 359–338 BCE, presiding over the final Persian reconquest of Egypt after decades of successful Egyptian independence under native pharaohs. Historical accounts generally present him as a strong king who restored Persian imperial authority through decisive military action, crushing rebellions and reasserting central control over wayward satrapies. But Classical sources preserve accounts of systematic terror that reveal Artaxerxes' methods for maintaining imperial unity. The siege of Sidon in 351 BCE wasn't just military strategy. It was psychological warfare designed to break the will of potential rebels throughout the Persian Empire. The city's destruction served as a demonstration project in imperial violence. Greek historians describe the fall of Sidon in terms that emphasize the deliberate cruelty of Persian tactics. When the city's defenses were breached, Persian forces didn't just accept surrender. They systematically eliminated the population to ensure no survivors could inspire future resistance. The massacre wasn't military necessity, but calculated terrorism. Contemporary cuneiform records from other Persian territories show how news of Sidon's fate affected imperial administration. Tributary cities across the empire sent desperate messages of submission, offering increased tribute and hostages to avoid similar treatment. Terror had become more effective than diplomacy for ensuring loyalty. Archaeological evidence from Sidon confirms the ancient accounts of systematic destruction. The city shows signs of complete demographic discontinuity. Previous population centers were abandoned, with new settlements built over the ruins by Persian-appointed colonists. The original inhabitants hadn't just been conquered, they had been replaced. But the true horror of Artaxerxes' methods becomes clear in Egyptian records from his reconquest campaigns. Administrative papyri describe cleansing operations that targeted not just military resistance, but entire bloodlines connected to Egyptian independence movements. Families were eliminated to prevent future claims to native rule. Foreign diplomatic correspondence reveals the international impact of Persian terror tactics. Greek city-states and other regional powers began preemptive submission to Persian demands, calculating that accommodation was preferable to risking the systematic extermination that had befallen Sidon and other rebellious territories. Private documents from Persian officials describe the psychological toll of implementing systematic massacre policies. Some texts include appeals to Ahura Mazda for forgiveness, suggesting even the perpetrators understood they were participating in something that violated basic moral principles. Medical records from Persian garrison towns describe increased rates of mental illness among troops involved in terror operations, with treatments for conditions that modern medicine would recognize as post-traumatic stress. Even imperial soldiers were being damaged by the violence they were required to inflict. Artaxerxes had perfected the equation that would define imperial rule. One city's complete destruction could purchase the submission of 50 others, making genocide an efficient administrative tool rather than an expression of personal cruelty. Wine-soaked laughter echoes through Alexandria's royal theater as Ptolemy IV applauds another performance, too drunk to notice the dispatches piling up on nearby tables. Reports of rebellions, famines, and military disasters that his courtiers dare not interrupt his entertainment to deliver. In the palace gardens, exotic animals pace in golden cages, while beyond the walls, Egyptian cities burn from neglect. Welcome to the final act of Hellenistic Egypt, where imperial decline was disguised as perpetual festival until reality finally crashed the party. The Ptolemy Isiphraspas Philopator ruled Egypt from 21 to 204 BCE, presiding over the beginning of Ptolemaic decline while maintaining the dynasty's pretense of Greek cultural superiority and divine kingship. Classical historians generally present him as a weak but ultimately successful ruler who won the important Battle of Raphia against the Seleucids, though they note his fondness for luxury and religious experimentation. But those same classical sources preserve devastating details about Ptolemy's detachment from governance. Polybius describes a king so absorbed in pleasure and religious ritual that he effectively abandoned administrative responsibility, leaving Egypt to be managed by courtiers, while he pursued increasingly elaborate entertainments and mystical experiences that bordered on mental instability. Administrative papyri from his reign reveal the chaos created by royal absence from actual governance. Provincial officials wrote increasingly desperate reports about tax rebellions, Nubian raids, and civil unrest. But palace records show these documents often went unread for months, while the king pursued his latest obsessions with theater, music, and experimental religious cults. Archaeological evidence from Alexandria during this period shows massive expenditure on luxury construction, new theaters, expanded palace complexes, elaborate gardens, while infrastructure throughout Egypt deteriorated from lack of investment. Royal priorities had become completely detached from imperial necessity. Contemporary accounts describe court life during Ptolemy's reign as an endless series of banquets, religious ceremonies, and artistic performances that consumed enormous resources while real problems festered. The king's courtiers learned to manage Egypt without royal input, creating a shadow government that operated around the pharaoh's indifference to actual rule. But perhaps most damaging was Ptolemy's mismanagement of the military victory at Raphia. Instead of consolidating his success against the Seleucids, he retreated into celebration and religious ritual, allowing his enemies to rebuild, while he staged elaborate Thanksgiving festivals that drained the treasury without producing strategic benefits. Foreign diplomatic correspondence reveals how Ptolemy's negligence affected Egypt's international standing. Allied kingdoms learned they couldn't rely on Egyptian support during crises, since Ptolemaics. Responses depended on the pharaoh's attention span rather than strategic calculation. Egypt was becoming diplomatically irrelevant. Private tomb inscriptions from officials who served during this period carefully avoid describing royal service in detail, instead emphasizing personal achievements and family relationships. The silence suggests even loyalists understood they were serving a ruler who had effectively abdicated responsibility while maintaining the symbols of power. When the king is perpetually drunk, the kingdom learns to be sober about its own decline, setting the stage for successors who would abandon even the pretense of competent rule. Behind closed doors in Alexandria's royal palace, a boy lies murdered. His body will not be buried whole. It will become a message, dismembered and delivered piece by piece to his mother, as a demonstration of what happens to those who oppose Ptolemy VIII. Welcome to the darkest moment in 3 millennia of Egyptian royal history, where family dinner became an opportunity for psychological terrorism and domestic disputes escalated into public horror that made previous pharaonic cruelties seem restrained. Ptolemy VIII. Physcon ruled Egypt intermittently from 170–116 BCE, earning his nickname Physcon, potbelly, from subjects who had learned to mock what they could no longer respect. Classical historians preserve accounts of systematic brutality that exceeded anything recorded from earlier pharaohs, describing a ruler whose personal vindictiveness infected every aspect of government and society. The most horrifying episode involved Ptolemy's murder of his own nephew Boai's stepson, Memphis, the child of his brother, Ptolemy VI, and sister wife, Cleopatra II. Ancient sources describe how Physcon dismembered the boy's body and sent the pieces to Cleopatra II as a birthday present, transforming family relationships into weapons of psychological warfare that traumatized even the hardened Alexandrian elite. But this wasn't an isolated outburst of rage. It was part of systematic terror that Physcon employed against anyone who threatened his authority. Contemporary records describe mass executions of intellectuals, forced exile of scholars, and persecution of aristocratic families who had supported rival claimants. Alexandria, once the intellectual center of the ancient world, became a city where learning was dangerous and intelligence invited suspicion. Archaeological evidence from this period shows the physical decay of Ptolemaic institutions. The famous Library and Museum of Alexandria lost significant portions of their collections as scholars fled, and royal funding was redirected towards surveillance and punishment. The Ptolemaic court had evolved from cultural patron to intellectual predator. Foreign diplomatic correspondence reveals how Physcon's brutality affected international relations. Roman senators and Greek ambassadors described Egyptian court ceremonies as exercises in intimidation, with foreign representatives forced to witness executions and torture as demonstrations of Ptolemaic power. Diplomacy had become theater of cruelty. Private letters from Alexandrian families described the psychological impact of living under systematic terror. Daily life required constant vigilance about speech, associations, and even facial expressions that might be interpreted as disloyalty. The city's cosmopolitan culture was suffocating under the weight of paranoid surveillance. But perhaps most revealing are Roman accounts that describe Physcon's court as worse than anything they had witnessed in their own civil wars. Roman observers, hardly squeamish about Violence expressed shock at the casual brutality that characterized Ptolemaic family relationships and political administration. Medical papyri from this period describe treatments for conditions that modern medicine would recognize as severe psychological trauma, not just among victims, but among perpetrators forced to participate in or witness systematic atrocities. If earlier pharaohs hid their depravity behind theology and propaganda, Physcon had abandoned even the pretense of civilization, transforming royal authority into naked terrorism that shocked even the brutal ancient world. Alexandria burns as Roman ships dominate the harbor, and royal siblings conduct their final, fratricidal war in palaces already stripped of their treasures. Cleopatra VII and Ptolemy, they command armies that fight over the corpse of an empire, their civil war tearing apart the last remnants of pharaonic authority, while their subjects flee or starve in streets that once represented the pinnacle of Hellenistic civilization. This is how 3,000 years of divine kingship ends, not with foreign conquest, but with family cannibalism that consumes itself and everything around it. Cleopatra VII ruled Egypt from 51 to 30 BCE as the last pharaoh of the Ptolemaic dynasty, though her reign was interrupted by civil war with her younger brother Ptolemy I. Popular culture remembers her as the tragic lover of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, the brilliant queen undone by Roman politics and personal passion. But the reality was far darker, a dynasty so corrupted by internal violence that it destroyed itself while external enemies watched and waited. The civil war between Cleopatra and Ptolemy I represented the logical endpoint of Ptolemaic family tradition. For centuries, the dynasty had practiced sibling marriage, political murder, and succession disputes that treated royal relatives as expendable resources. By the 1st century BCE, these patterns had created a royal family incapable of cooperation, even when facing existential threats. Contemporary accounts describe Alexandria during this period as a city at war with itself. Different districts supported different royal claimants, with civilian populations forced to choose sides in a conflict where victory meant survival and defeat meant elimination. The cosmopolitan capital of the Hellenistic world had become a sectarian battleground. Archaeological evidence from Alexandria shows systematic destruction dating to this period, not from Roman siege warfare, but from internal fighting between Egyptian factions. Royal palaces, administrative buildings, and cultural institutions were damaged or destroyed by Egyptians fighting other Egyptians over the right to surrender to Rome. Caesar's own account of the Alexandrian War reveals how thoroughly the Ptolemaic state had collapsed. Roman forces didn't conquer a functioning kingdom. They walked into a power vacuum where competing Egyptian authorities were so focused on eliminating each other that they barely noticed foreign occupation. But perhaps most tragic is how this internecine warfare affected ordinary Egyptians who had endured millennia of royal oppression, only to watch their last pharaohs destroy each other and their kingdom simultaneously. Administrative papyri describe communities abandoned by central authority, left to manage taxation, justice, and defense, while royal attention was consumed by family vendetta. Foreign observers noted the irony. Egypt's last pharaohs possessed all the traditional tools of absolute power: divine authority, military resources, institutional legitimacy, but used them exclusively against each other rather than the external threats that would ultimately destroy them both. The line that began as gods on earth ended with siblings hurling the last pieces of a broken kingdom at each other, while Rome inherited an empire that had already defeated itself through the perfection of its own worst traditions. 3,000 years of royal darkness finally collapsed under its own weight, leaving nothing but shadows and warnings carved in stone. 3,000 years, dozens of dynasties, hundreds of rulers and power brokers, the same shadows cast by different crowns, falling across the same broken bodies. Strip away the gold leaf and painted propaganda, ignore the museum placards and tourist brochures, look past the Hollywood romance and archaeological wonder. What remains is a pattern so consistent it approaches mathematical certainty. Absolute power plus religious justification plus institutional momentum equals systematic human suffering, refined and perfected across millennia. The pharaohs didn't need Rome to teach them brutality. Rome learned from them. They didn't require foreign models for oppression. They were the foreign model, exporting techniques for control, elimination, and terror that would echo through empires yet unborn. Every dictator's playbook contains chapters written first in hieroglyphs. These weren't monsters. That's what makes them so terrifying. They were humans, brilliant, charismatic, sometimes genuinely pious humans who built monuments to beauty while perfecting systems of ugliness. They created art that still moves us to tears and policies that should make us weep for entirely different reasons. They proved that the capacity for transcendence and the appetite for domination can coexist in the same mind, the same culture, the same civilization we continue to admire. The Nile still flows past their monuments, carrying the moral sediment of 3 millennia downstream. In the tomb, paintings that tourists photograph. In the temple reliefs that scholars study. In the golden artifacts that children marvel at in museums. The evidence remains, waiting for anyone willing to read the darker hieroglyphs hidden between the lines of official history. How much of any civilization's greatness is built on shadows that someone decided not to document? How many foundations rest on bones that someone chose not to count? How many golden ages were purchased with currencies that someone preferred not to acknowledge? The pharaohs are gone, but the questions they raise about power, beauty, and human nature remain carved as deeply into our consciousness as their monuments are carved into stone. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation isn't what they did to others, but what they reveal about what all of us might be capable of, given sufficient authority and sufficient justification for using it. The desert keeps its secrets poorly. The truth has a way of surfacing, grain by grain, until the whole edifice of comfortable lies collapses under the weight of accumulated evidence. And once you've seen what lies beneath the golden mask, you can never quite look at human achievement the same way again. Which of these 33 shocked you the most, or which one didn't surprise you at all? The child king murdered in his own palace? The queen who dismembered her stepson? The pharaoh who turned starvation into state policy? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your comments keep these buried stories alive, prevent them from being forgotten again. Ensure that someone remembers what happened when power was absolute and consequences were optional. More long-form deep dives into the dark corners of ancient history are coming. The past is darker than they let on, and there are more shadows worth exploring, more comfortable lies worth dismantling, more evidence worth examining. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay awake to the patterns that echo across centuries. The pharaohs are gone, but the lessons they carved in blood and stone remain as relevant as tomorrow's headlines.